In addition to calling for the UN to end its bias against Israel, she has made crystal clear that the international body can no longer be used to promote anti-Semitism. And I was pleased to see Ambassador Haley recognize that human rights and conflict are directly connected, in her words. From my standpoint, I think regimes that don't respect the citizens over which they hold power and visitors like Otto Warmbier won't respect their neighbors, won't respect international agreements. And given its terrible human rights record, it is no surprise that North Korea is determined to deploy international nuclear ballistic weapons technology. And that threatens the region, and it threatens the United States. Meanwhile, companies and banks inside China continue to provide critical hard currency to that regime. The United Nations has passed good Security Council resolutions on North Korea, spurred by U.S. legislation that we passed in this committee. But solid enforcement is needed. As we will hear today, the President's budget proposal includes significant reductions in U.S. funding of the United Nations and its agencies. UN peacekeeping has played a critical role over the years in advancing U.S. interests and should be prioritized in accordance with U.S. law. The recent deaths of peacekeepers in South Sudan and in Mali remind us of the dangers they face. But peacekeeping would find more support if failing missions, some decades old, were closed and the horrendous sexual abuses tackled head-on. This committee has pushed to improve the UN's transparency and accountability, advancing protections of whistleblowers and bringing UN peacekeepers that are sexual predators to the bar of justice. Ambassador Haley, we look forward to hearing how we can support you working to improve transparency and accountability. This committee stands ready to assist in your difficult tasks ahead, and I now turn to the ranking member for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Ambassador, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. I've watched you in the short months that you've been ambassador. I hope you're enjoying my hometown of New York, best place in the world, and I've watched you with admiration in terms of how you've been conducting yourself. As I said to you in the room before we started, we pride ourselves on this committee in being the most bipartisan committee in the Congress. The Chairman and I have worked very hard to do that. Where there are disagreements, but we all share the same goal. And of course, the United States is the world's biggest superpower. We believe that we have a lot to offer the world and want to continue to work with all the countries of the world. I was disappointed in the budget. I said this to Secretary Tillerson as well. It cuts our support for peacekeeping efforts in the United Nations by nearly 40%. Peacekeeping missions help people who have been driven from their homes by atrocities in South Sudan. UN peacekeepers are now protecting nearly 250,000 civilians in places like Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire. Missions are scheduled to close soon because they've been so effective in building stability and security. We are traditionally invested a little more than the minimum required in peacekeeping, and that's what I think an indispensable power should do, which is what we have done. That's to show the world we're a big-hearted country that wants to see people all around the world live healthy, prosperous lives. American personnel are not deployed by these efforts. Our men and women aren't put in harm's way. These initiatives help prevent and resolve crises so that we don't have to intervene militarily, and they do it for 8 times less than it would cost to send an American soldier. So burden sharing, I know there's been talk about burden sharing. I believe these efforts have a definition of burden sharing. The administration is also seeking to completely eliminate American support for the UN Development Program, for disaster relief coordination, for UN Women, for the UN Population Fund, for UNICEF, support for children living in the most desperate circumstances, 100% reduction. I think that needs to be changed. The UN has its problems. No one disputes that. We talked a little while about some of them. I personally think the way Israel is blamed and bullied by UN members is terrible. As I told you before, the so-called Human Rights Council has the worst human rights abusers on that council, and it is the epitome of gall, or chutzpah, as we say in New York, to think that they can sit look at anybody in judgment of anybody, given the fact that they have the most abysmal human rights records in the world. It almost makes it a little bit like Alice in Wonderland. But I do think American leadership is urgently needed to help shape Security Council resolutions and initiatives at other UN bodies, and when appropriate, use our veto to counter this imbalance. But walking away from our commitments isn't the right way to effect the reform that we all want to see. I believe these cuts would send a deeply troubling message to UN members that the United States no longer wants to be a global leader on a whole range of issues, that we're willing to cede the ground excuse me, to whomever steps into our place. And I can't imagine a more harmful course if we want our values and our priorities to be the values and priorities of other countries, then withdrawing from multilateral engagement is a grave miscalculation. And make no mistake, Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and plenty of others would be more than happy to see us back away. So I'm glad that Congress will have the last word on the budget issues. I remain deeply concerned about the number of other areas where American foreign policy is going off course and how that affects our ability to work with other governments through the UN. I hope your testimony will address some of these problems. And let me say, as I told you before, I look forward to working with you. You have approached this job with a zest and a verve. It's been very refreshing. We will from time to time have policy differences, but I think we all stand for the same thing, obviously, and that's what we've tried to do in the Foreign Relations Committee. So welcome. I look forward to your testimony, and I look forward to your tenure as a UN ambassador. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. I now yield to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Jeff Duncan, to introduce our witness today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure for me to introduce my friend, Ambassador Nikki Haley, to my colleagues. A South Carolina native, Ambassador Haley graduated from my alma mater, the 2016 National Football Champion Clemson Tigers. I'm shameless, guys, shameless. Ambassador Haley made her career as a trailblazer. In 2004, she became the first Indian American to hold a South Carolina public office when she won a seat in the South Carolina State House, where I served with her for 6 years. In 2010, she was elected the first female, as well as the first minority governor of South Carolina. In her tenure as governor of South Carolina, Ambassador Haley brought investment and jobs from all over the world. South Carolina now holds more than 1,200 operations of international firms which employ more than 131,000 South Carolinians. A lot of this investment was directly tied to Governor Haley's efforts, especially in businesses in Europe and in Asia. On November 22nd, 2016, the President-elect Donald Trump picked her to become the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, where she continues to strongly represent American interests on the world stage. Ambassador Haley, welcome to Congress, and we look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
And welcome, Ambassador. Without objection, the Ambassador's full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or any extraneous material for the record. And I would ask you, Ambassador, if you could summarize your remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much. And to my friend Jeff, go Tigers, and thank you for that introduction. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss advancing U.S. interests at the United Nations. 5 months and 3 days ago, I was sworn in as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. I came into this position at a time when many Americans felt a deep sense of betrayal at the UN in the wake of the passage of Resolution 2334. At my confirmation hearing, I made the following promise. If I am privileged to be the U.S. Ambassador, I will never sit passively while America's interests and America's friends are run down at the UN. 5 months later, I can say that I haven't been quiet on the issues important to the United States. And I can say this, I have kept my promise. Our friends and our rivals know that America has once again found its voice at the United Nations. The international community is now very clear about what the U.S. is for and what the U.S. is against. It wasn't long after my confirmation that my promise was put to the test. In early April, the Syrian regime dropped chemical weapons on Syrian children. We forced the Security Council to hold an open emergency session, which some member states didn't want. We drew a red line. If the UN would not act collectively, the United States would act alone, and we did. We've brought new accountability to the North Korean regime. When North Korea continued its illegal missile tests, we brought all the nations of the Security Council together, including China and Russia, to impose new sanctions. Even as we focus on North Korea's nuclear and missile threat, we also continue to highlight the barbaric human rights violations the regime is committing. Otto Warmbier's death brought home to Americans the brutality that North Koreans have known for decades. The same clear voice we've used to take on our adversaries, we've also used to support America's values and America's friends. Thanks to U.S. leadership, human rights are at the forefront of the UN agenda. For the first time ever during the U.S. presidency of the Security Council, we convened a meeting dedicated solely to the protection of human rights and their relationship to conflict. We made the case that human rights violations and conflict are directly related. History is played out. When governments don't respect the rights and voices of the people, conflict will soon follow. We've also called out the UN Human Rights Council for legitimizing human rights violators at the expense of their victims. We've put forward reforms to make the Council what it was meant to be, a place of conscience for nations and justice for victims. I traveled to Geneva earlier this month to make it clear to the Council that continued U.S. participation is contingent on adoption of these reforms. On a related note, the U.S. mission now refuses to tolerate one of the UN's most disreputable and dangerous habits, obsessively bashing Israel. We forced the withdrawal of a false and biased report, and we've steered the Security Council's monthly debate on the Middle East away from unfairly targeting Israel and toward the true threats in the region, such as Iran and Hamas. In the areas in which the UN has real value, we've built on its good work. Peacekeeping is one of the most important things the UN does. We are reviewing every one of the peacekeeping missions with an eye toward ensuring that we have clear and achievable mandates. We are also working to ensure that troops are ready, professional, and committed to the safety of civilians on the ground. Troops in the UN peacekeeping mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for instance, have long faced charges of sexual abuse and other serious misconduct. We inserted clear instructions into the mission's most recent mandate to enforce performance standards for troops. There is no place in any UN peacekeeping mission for predatory and abusive troops. Our peacekeeping reforms are aimed at producing more effective missions for vulnerable citizens. We will hold governments accountable to their responsibility to protect their own citizens while also cutting down waste and efficiency. We've adapted the mission in Haiti to changing conditions on the ground and are on target to save at least $150 million for the year. We will continue our reform efforts when we take up the peacekeeping mission renewal this month in Darfur, Sudan. Our efforts will hold the government accountable to improve humanitarian access. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to highlight our efforts to reassert U.S. leadership at the United Nations. It's hard to believe it's only been 5 months since I moved my family to New York to begin this exciting and challenging new chapter. I look forward to more progress in the months ahead, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Haley. Let me start with this point. This week, the White House issued a firm statement, a warning to Syria after it was picked up that Assad, his regime, was preparing potentially for another chemical weapons attack. You amplified that message yourself. Have we seen Assad's regime take any steps in response to that warning?
Well, I can tell you that due to the president's actions, we did not see an incident. What we did see before was all of the same activity that we had seen prior for the April 4th chemical weapons attack. And so I think that by the president calling out Assad, I think by us continuing to remind Iran and Russia that while they choose to back aside, that this was something we were not going to put up with. So I would like to think that the president saved many innocent men, women, and children.
Let me ask you a question on the UN Security Council resolutions that were passed with respect to North Korea. We're a few years away from North Korea having an ICBM capability that can reach the U.S., and we have this question about enforcement. We have a second bill, in addition to the sanctions bill, which I and Mr. Engel passed formally and that was signed into law. We have a second bill to try to close any additional loopholes. Specifically, what we're trying to do is to stop the use of forced labor by North Korea, where they'll have workers sent to the Middle East and other countries, and instead of the workers being paid, the money goes right back into the bank account of the North Korean regime and is used on its nuclear weapons program. So we're trying to cut off that hard currency and trying to cut off some of the hard currency that comes out of Beijing that subsidizes the regime, even with the sanctions that the Security Council has passed. Can you tell us if we had enforcement, what would be the impact on North Korea's regime and their ability to move forward with this nuclear weapons program?
The more pressure we put on North Korea, the better. You are dealing with a paranoid leader who thinks that we are trying to assassinate him, who thinks we are trying to do regime change, who keeps his public in the dark, only hearing what he wants them to hear. And what we need to remember is that he is building a nuclear program, and you are more optimistic saying it is multiple years before an ICBM comes forward. I think it's going to happen sooner because they are on target to do that, and they continue to use their people for those violations. So I would welcome any sort of pressure that you could put forward to slow down that process of nuclear development.
Well, I think this is so critical. Secretary Mattis has said that North Korea is the #1 threat from his standpoint, and I think key also is to get the Senate to take action now, and I would suggest immediately. That bill has been over there for some time. I also wanted to ask you about the Human Rights Commission and how your efforts to sort of change this system to competitive voting rather than regional rotation in order to make sure that the Human Rights Council ditches some of its old procedures and ditches the anti-Israel focus. I mean, we had 70 resolutions against Israel and very few to touch on Iran or other human rights abusers around the planet. How is that going? You sat down with, I know, many Europeans when you traveled over there to make this pitch to those governments. Can you give us an update on that?
Yes, and I can give you an example that will bring it very close to home. We have seen terrible things happening in Venezuela, and we continue to be very, very concerned. And so we brought up I called for an emergency session in the Security Council for Venezuela. And my colleagues were not appreciative of that because they said it wasn't a peace and security issue and that it needed to be heard at the Human Rights Council. The problem is the Human Rights Council never heard anything or condemned Venezuela because Venezuela sits on the council, along with Cuba and Saudi Arabia and China, and the list goes on. So I didn't want to send a statement from New York. I thought it was important that I went in person. I explained to them that this can't be a place bad actors go to protect themselves and point fingers at others. I told them the agenda item 7 that picked on Israel, those issues can go to agenda item 4. Many of them agreed that it discredited the Human Rights Council. I do think we were heard, and I do hope that there's a change.
Thank you. My time's expired. I go to Mr. Elliot Engel of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to piggyback on the question about the Human Rights Commission. First of all, let me say, Madam Ambassador, I heard your speech at AIPAC, and I thought it was a very fine speech. What so aggravates me about the UN Human Rights Council is that they have a nerve, as I said before, to try to sit in judgment of anybody else. People should be investigating them for the worst human rights abuses, and they do it to their own people as well. So the UN Human Rights Council has targeted Israel ever since its creation. They have Agenda Item 7. It's a permanent agenda item targeting Israel. It's the only country-specific agenda item at the Council. Obviously, it's ridiculous and unfair, and the membership of the Council is an embarrassment to the UN. Some of the members engage in the worst abuses. With all the problems with the Council, I do recognize that because of U.S. leadership, the Council has begun to shift its scrutiny to some of the world's worst human rights violators. According to the American Jewish Committee's Jacob Blaustein Institute, U.S. participation has improved the Council's treatment of Israel to some degree and shifted some of the Council's focus to human rights violations in North Korea, Iran, and Syria. At the same time, according to Hillel Neuer of UN Watch, the 2006 through 2009 U.S. boycott of the Council, and I'm going to quote him, did nothing to prevent the Council from continuing to cause damage. So I have a couple of questions about this. What steps do you propose taking to remove Agenda Item 7 from the Council's agenda and reform criteria for membership of the Council? And I abhor conferring legitimacy on any entity which discriminates against Israel or is so one-sided, but I worry, on the other hand, if the U.S. withdrew from the Council, things could actually get worse. So I'd like you to comment on that, too. What would be the impact of U.S. priorities, including the protection of Israel, if the U.S. were to withdraw from the UN Human Rights Council?
Well, thank you, Mr. Engel, and that is my dilemma, which is, are we better off being on the Human Rights Council with all of these bad actors where it's very hard to give the Council any credit, or do we do our own human rights fights outside of the Council? That's what remains to be seen. The reason I went there was I thought it was important. In reference to Agenda Item 7, when I met with the like-minded members of the Council, they admitted that Agenda Item 7 was embarrassing. They admitted that it discredited the Council. They admitted that they thought it needed to come off. What we found out is there are three main groups that continue to use Agenda Item 7. It's the Egyptians, it's the Saudis, and it's Pakistan. So those are the three. Everyone else has shifted to Agenda Item 4. We actually think that the Palestinians would be okay if we shifted to Item 4, if we talk to those three groups. So that is my focus now, is trying to talk to those three groups to see how we can shift them off of Agenda Item 7. The truth is, if somebody wants to bring Israel up for a violation, that can happen under Agenda Item 4. But if you don't have an agenda for North Korea, you don't have it for Syria, you don't have it for Venezuela, it really is nothing more than abusive to have it on Israel, especially with all the threats in the world. And so I think they took this seriously. I am continuing to have meetings on this. We met with Commissioner Zaid and told him that we needed his help on this front when it came to that. He agreed, and he felt like it was doable. So it's going to take a full court press, and I'm going to need all of you to help in terms of pushing that narrative that we really want to do that. And I think they don't want us to leave the Human Rights Council. And so we've just said there's got to be competitive elections. We've got to make sure that it's not already decided who's going to be on there. And then we have to get the General Assembly to not vote for these bad actors. It happened last time Russia ran, and Russia lost. That was a huge moment because Russia, typically the P5 always win an election, but that was due to what they were doing with Ukraine. And so there is a possibility of change. We just have to be very aggressive about doing that.
Thank you. My time is almost up, but I wanted to reiterate some of the things I said before. I get just as angry at the UN as anybody when you think that they take us for granted, but I don't want to cut off my nose to spite my face. United States presence at the UN is very, very important, and I worry about the President's proposed budget cuts to UN funding, and I wish that the administration would take another look at that. 9 of your predecessors signed on to a letter in support of the continued payment of U.S. voluntary and assessed contributions to the UN, saying the cuts weaken our hand, alienate allies, and cost us more over the long run. I wonder if you could quickly comment on that.
My job was to go in and see if I could find value in the UN. That was the directive all of you gave me. That was the directive the president gave me. There are a lot of places that the UN is very effective. There's a lot of fat around the edges and some abuses that happen at the UN. But I do think it is very important that we make the most of it. And I will tell you that from the president's budget, keep in mind that that was more of making a point. It was making a point that he wanted to strengthen the military, and it was putting the United Nations on notice, and it worked. And I have used that as leverage because now we're seeing a lot of the other countries come forward and say, yes, we should do reform. When it comes to peacekeeping reform, they have worked with us on every single renewal to change it, to make it smarter, to make it better work for the people. When it comes to management reform, they're working with us on changing it. So I really do think the message was effective. And my hope is that I can be your conduit in terms of working from the president's budget to where y'all have to make some decisions to help you know exactly what I think is important in order for us to continue to have a strong voice at the UN.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Eliana Ross-Layton of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
Welcome,
Thank you.
Madam Ambassador. You've done an admirable job in your first few months and have demonstrated strong leadership at the UN. I also want to commend you for your forceful words against the Maduro regime. Thank you. Speaking out so strongly in support of the Venezuelan people. Things have gotten, they've taken a turn for the worse just in the last 24 hours. As you know, there was a helicopter attack targeting the Supreme Court by Maduro, and Maduro-controlled armed colectivos surrounded the National Assembly. So the violence is escalating. And thank you to Mr. Deutsch for bringing up Venezuela with the Secretary General yesterday. What actions are you considering to hold Maduro accountable at the UN? Are you considering Security Council actions or sanctions? I know it's a difficult environment for you. How can we put pressure so that Maduro at least allows humanitarian assistance to help the people? And let me just quickly touch on 2 other topics, Madam Ambassador. I've introduced legislation over the years that exposes problems and offers solutions on UNRWA, particularly the incitement issues, the ties to Hamas from its employees, and the fact that U.S. taxpayer dollars are used to support this violence. UNRWA's mandate was extended, lamentably, through June 2020. How can Congress help to shift UNRWA's mandate to the UN High Commissioner of Refugees? Because 3 more years of this is unacceptable. And lastly, the Human Rights Council is in the process of creating a blacklist, a database for supporters of BDS to use to target Israel's interests. Where does this database effort stand right now, and what are we doing to kill this effort and prevent it from doing harm to Israel? Thank you, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you. So first on Venezuela, because the Human Rights Council would not hear the issue on Venezuela, we had the Emergency Security Council meeting in New York, but then when I went to Geneva, we had a hearing or we had a meeting outside of that to just discuss Venezuela issues to bring it home to the Human Rights Council that they needed to do this. The region very much didn't want us to talk about it and said that this would make things worse. But as you saw with the OAS, when they attempted to talk about it, Venezuela got out of the OAS, and then recently the OAS met again, and they were
And we didn't have the votes.
and they were unable to do anything. So
That's unbelievable.
I can tell you we need to keep the pressure on Maduro. There are signs that he's now going to start using his military and use weapons, and anything you've seen
been
on
doing
TV,
that.
it is so much worse. It is a terrible situation. And so as much pressure as we can continue to put on Maduro that we're watching,
Almost 80 people dead, thousands arrested,
it's
thousands in jail, and he's
just-
acting with impunity.
they just want to be heard. They just want to be heard. And it goes back to any government that doesn't listen and take care of their people, conflict will follow. It is a direct
So
correlation.
please keep acting on behalf of
And
the
we will
people.
continue
Thank you.
to do that.
On UNRWA and
So
BDS.
UNRWA, I will tell you, I actually went and visited an UNRWA camp when I went to Israel and the Palestinian area. I asked about the books and what we were seeing. They think they have gotten it down. They said the problem comes into the culture versus what we think is incitement. They are continuing to work on it. We are continuing the pressure on them.
Baloney.
We'll continue to do that. I do think that we need to look at UNRWA in a way that we expect more of them and put pressure on them so that we can get the changes that we need to have. Changes in what they consider to be a refugee, changes in any textbooks and incitement, changes in Hamas members teaching in the schools. There's work. I will say that there's also good that comes out of UNRWA. What they do with the schools and the health care, you do see value in it, but I think we just need to continue to pressure them on the things we want to see change.
Thank you. And on BDS?
The concern on UNRWA is they are now trying to get assessed contributions in the UN, and we are fighting that back desperately. On BDS, it's something I spoke about in Geneva and said that it was a problem. I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned that we may not be able to defeat this, but we are trying extremely hard to show that this is something that cannot happen. As governor in South Carolina, we were the first state to fight it off. I know how dangerous and abusive this would be, and so we'll continue fighting this the whole way through.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep kicking butt. Thank you.
Brad Sherman of California.
Madam Ambassador, thank you for your work on behalf of the people of South Sudan, your briefing of April 25th, and I hope you're able to achieve our objectives there. I also want to thank you and join with my colleagues in thanking you for your efforts to refute and to halt the UN's obsessive tendencies with unjustified attacks on Israel. I hope that you're pushing inside the administration to get them to fill the empty boxes on the organization chart. Now, Rex Tillerson has praised the people who are filling the acting positions. Acting assistant secretary, acting undersecretary. My wife's been with the State Department for 20 years. You can't get policy direction from somebody who's got the big word temporary on their door. Until we get those positions filled with people that reflect where the administration want to go, we don't have foreign policy in the hundreds of areas that you and the Secretary of State can't personally address. The world is better when the United States is involved. We're involved in the United Nations. We're not necessarily going to be paying our dues or our share of peacekeeping. Is it easier or harder for you to do your job if we don't pay our dues?
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, we will continue to work on South Sudan. I'll be visiting there in the fall to deal with it head on. Israel, I will continue to call them out every time that happens. I hear you on the State Department and what you told Secretary Tillerson. We have worked really hard to fill the roles in USUN and are almost there, so thank you for that. In terms of the peacekeeping budget, what we did was with
Both the peacekeeping and the dues budget, yeah.
peacekeeping and
My question was on the both. We have our general UN
Right.
dues, the line item for that in the President's proposed budget's cut 27%.
Right.
Peacekeeping, 37%. Does that diminish your ability to do your job, or does it make your job easier?
No, so my job has worked well because I've used that as leverage. With every single renewal, what we did was we looked at the political solution. We looked, is it working? Is it actually helping the people on the ground? What they have done in the past is challenged areas, they would just send more troops to it. Well, if the troops aren't trained and the troops don't have equipment, it's not going to be effective. So what we've now done is change the mandates to make sure they're smarter.
I'm going to cut you off there because I got these.
Well, let me just tell you
some
this. We just negotiated the peacekeeping budget last week, and I was so proud of my team because we cut it by $500 million. And that was with the support of everyone
But now that it's a budget you like, should we contribute our allotted share?
I think that you can comfortably go to 25% and know that we will be okay.
Russia is we have a bill that passed the Senate to impose sanctions on Russia and Iran. It's got its congressional review provisions. I've been here a long time. The only way we got the sanctions on Iran was to overcome efforts of the last two administrations who wanted either no sanctions or wanted the administration to be able to just wave a wand and say, well, we don't like them, so we're not going to do them. Is the administration lobbying to change the congressional review provisions of the Senate-passed Iran-Russia sanctions bill?
I am not aware that they are lobbying for anything. I do know that they're reviewing it.
Okay. Other administration...
They also renewed recently
right.
the sanctions on Russia in reference to Ukraine. Those were renewed last week.
Other administration officials have testified that they haven't spoken with the president regarding Russian interference in last year's election. Have you talked to the president about that?
I have not talked to the president about that. And look, I think the best thing that can happen is for this investigation to play out quickly. I have no reason to think that there was any sort of involvement between the president and Russia. And
I'm going to try to move on to one last question. The UN Security Council Resolution 2231 bans or deters Iran from testing ballistic missiles. Is the Security Council incapable of addressing Iran's violations of that resolution?
well, we're going to push hard to address it. They have tested, they have launched ballistic missiles, and now we are seeing that they are sending off weapons and things to bad actors. And so, yes, we have to continue to address that. The problem is Russia will always veto it.
Thank you.
We go now to Chris Smith
Thank you very
of
much,
New Jersey.
Chairman. Thank you for convening
Good
this
morning.
important hearing. Good morning, Madam Ambassador. Thank you for your strong and effective leadership. It's principled. I know, talking to many of the diplomats in New York, how respected you are. You have absolutely made a mark, and you're deeply respected up here. So thank you for that leadership. There's no better friend or diplomat, otherwise, for Israel, and we thank you for that as well. Yesterday, Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, rightly designated China as a Tier 3 country, the Chinese government, the worst violator for sex and labor trafficking. I want to thank you, the administration, for making that bold and, I think, long-missed call. For years, we've been asking China, whether it be sex trafficking, somewhat attributable, if not largely attributable, to the missing girls, 62 million missing girls because of sex selection abortion. There's no other parallel in the world. And on labor trafficking, whether it be North Korea or the problems of just exploiting workers through what was thought to be a reform of the Laogai system, which didn't really happen. Thank you for that designation. It is very well accepted. Let me ask you about Liu Xiaobo, obviously Nobel Peace Prize winner who has terminal cancer. He is still in China. He's out of prison, we're told, getting medical care. But I know the administration has already asked that through our ambassador that he be allowed to come here and get treatment along with his wife, who has suffered de facto. Whatever you can do, and I know you have a good working relationship, even though I'm sure you butt heads occasionally with the Chinese ambassador, let him come and let him come now, please. So I would ask you for that. Let me ask you, too, on the special envoy for combating anti-Semitism. That post has not been filled. I'm the one who offered the amendment in the year 2004 to establish it. It remains unfulfilled, and rightly so. The American Jewish groups are very, very upset by that omission. Fill it. Put the people in there. Don't double hat it, I would ask respectfully. There is so much of a rise in anti-Semitism, and it's needed now, and that person, whoever he or she may be, can walk point on trying to stop this terrible hate that is on the rise around the world. Let me also just say thank you. Karen Bass and I were in South Sudan just a few weeks ago. I was there earlier in August. We met with Salva Kiir, and the change in UNMES is remarkable. They were a garrison military, UN deployment, that sat and did nothing when the Tehran compound was attacked, including a woman from my own district who was sexually abused. They just sat there, did nothing. We now, through your great leadership, have a very effective, much more robust mandate by UNMES. So I want to thank you for that leadership, and I know you worked hard on that. On famine, and you might want to speak to this, we're concerned, both Karen Bass and I were in refugee camps, 2 of them, and 1 IDP camp in Unity State. And there are shortages, particularly in Uganda. There was a 50% cut in food. And I know there's some $990 million that has been appropriated in the appropriations bill. Our hope is that it does not carry over into next year. It needs to be spent now. These people, these mostly women, 85% of the people in the camps are women or children. They are in desperate need of food security and food aid. So please make sure that money gets out. And finally, on WIPO, and I know we're running out of time, but last year we had 3 of our committees, including Ileana Ross-Layton, held a hearing on illicit transfers to rogue states of North Korea and Iran by the World Intellectual Property Organization and its Director General, Francis Gurry. Gurry retaliated against the whistleblowers who exposed the wrongdoing, and today we have people who have lost their jobs at the UN because they did the right thing. Please, this is an injustice. This has to be corrected. I ask for your personal intervention on that.
Thank you. So in reference to the person being held in China, letting them go, we are all on it at different levels of the administration. That is moving. In terms of the envoy for anti-Semitism, we welcome all the help we can get. Because I think that it is, I agree with you on that. In terms of South Sudan, we are seeing baby step progress in that area, but it's baby step. But we continue to work on that. Like I said, I'll be visiting in the fall to speak with President Kiir myself on behalf of the United States to see if we can put some pressure there. Also, know that South Sudan has fallen off the famine list, but it is still food insecure. It is still very volatile. It's still a vulnerable spot. Famine is on our radar across the board in all 4 of the regions that we need to be looking at. And so we're watching that closely and working on that. And yes, WIPO, we continue to work with them and work on issues that come up, and we will always do that. So please feel free to contact me anytime.
Greg Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Ambassador, I am actually stunned at the response that you just gave back to Mr. Sherman, that you've never spoken to the President of the United States about Russia's involvement in our democracy. Never talked to the President of the United States, and we've got to deal with Russia. And the biggest question that we've had recently is Russia's involvement and what they've done to our democracy. And for you not to have had a conversation with the President of the United States about that involvement is absolutely shocking to me. Secondly, you mentioned the word betrayal in your opening statement. Well, I want you to know that that's an appropriate word to describe what I'm hearing from my constituents and fellow Americans and our allies all across at home and abroad. They feel a sense of betrayal because of the way that the Trump administration has diminished America's leadership and global standing. Our allies have expressed their sense of betrayal and mixed messages coming from the president, and I believe this budget proposal is a betrayal of our nation's interests. So while you mention a sense of betrayal regarding a single UN resolution, I hope you recognize the deep sense of betrayal that many Americans are feeling right now as the administration pursues a path of isolation. Recent Pew polling shows that America's global image has been significantly hurt by President Trump. The one exception, Russia. They have confidence in him. And I know that this matters when it comes to diplomacy and our ability to successfully engage internationally. You mentioned earlier about human rights. Yet when the president went to Saudi Arabia, there was no mention of human rights. When he went to Egypt, there was no mention of human rights. When he met with the Chinese, there was no mention of human rights. When he had the Russians in his office giving away national secrets, there was no mention of human rights. So I am concerned about, yet when he went to Europe, where our allies are, he was critical of them and criticized them. So it seems to me that the actions of the President of the United States will make your job a very difficult job, because you're supposed to be working with everyone and with the decrease in confidence in the United States, it seems to me that that would complicate your job to advance our national interests. And then it seems as though we're not sure when you say one thing and the president comes back and he says something else. So how do you handle situations in which the White House contradicts or overrides something you have publicly said or the Secretary of State have publicly said with regards to U.S. policy? How is and who determines what that U.S. policy is? And given all this, especially with the Pew polls that's going on, it seems as though we've lost a lot of our leadership around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks, and I want to know what coffee you're drinking this morning because I need to start drinking that. First of all, let's go through, because I want to answer all of these. These are very important questions. First of all, with Russia, my conversations with the president are very much, you've seen me bash Russia on Ukraine, you've seen me bash Russia on Syria, you've seen me call out Russia if we see any sort of wrongdoings by Russia, and yes, I do think Russia meddled in our elections, and yes, I have said that to the president. So having said that, I haven't asked the president any further questions because it's not something that's on my radar. I don't get asked about any of those things at the United Nations. So I'm very focused on my work in New York, and that has never come up once. There's no issues with Russia that have come up once by any member state in the UN, and so that's the focus. U.S. leadership and our global standing. Mr. Meeks, we have really put a strong voice of the U.S. at the UN. I mean, they know we're back, they know we're strong, and I will tell you, when the action took place to strike Syria, the number of ambassadors that came to me and said, it's so good to see the U.S. leading again. Very important.
Are we lead? Did we lead? Did we pulled out of the Paris Agreement?
Okay, I'm going down your list.
Okay,
So,
I'm just talking about how we're pulling out. We pulled out of a
I
number of
understand.
international. We have a president that's indicated that he wants to do bilateral, no multilateral agreements, that he has no confidence in multilateral
he
organizations.
supports me at the UN, and he supports what I'm doing at the UN. When you talk about human rights, I was the first person to ever bring up human rights at the Security Council. I went to Geneva to talk about human rights. I've been on it in terms of Venezuela, what's happening in South Sudan, all that. The president supports me on that. So when you talk about different views and those things that are happening, we're on the same team. For me to talk about it, he is supportive of that. And
You've
so
said it, the president hasn't.
I work for the president, and I don't go rogue on the president. He's very aware of what I'm doing. He's very supportive of it. And I can tell you that in all of these issues, we're not apart on it. He believes as strongly on the things I talk about as anyone else. And I would invite you to come to the United Nations so you can see for yourself the strength the U.S. is showing there, because it is strong, it is heard, and it is valuable.
We're going to go to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pretty strong coffee there, Gregory. Pretty strong coffee. I don't drink coffee myself.
I don't either. I might start.
I don't drink coffee either. I'm just concerned about my nation.
Okay, well, let me just note that I think betrayal is a very rough word, and I would suggest that anyone who voted for giving $150 billion to the Iranian government, making that available, should not be talking about the words betrayal.
I didn't use it, she did.
Okay, let's note. Madam Secretary, I'd like to, number one, join my colleagues in suggesting that Venezuela is something really important to look at, and those people down there. Venezuela used to be basically a shining example of how freedom can work, and although there were a lot of problems, people were working together there peacefully, and now for that to degenerate into what it is if we can lend a hand there, both at the United Nations and through as your spokesman there in the United Nations, make sure they know how concerned we are. We should also be concerned about Turkey. Turkey's going exactly in the wrong way, and these are things that we inherited from the last administration. Let me just note, Venezuela just didn't happen now. It's been headed that way. I'm sorry, the last administration did not do what they needed to be done. We need to do more in that area to support the good people there in Venezuela and Turkey. Let me note we also need to support the good people in Iran. Rather than giving $150 billion to their oppressors, we should be seeing what people we can actually be supportive of in Iran who oppose the mullah regime. So I would hope that in the United Nations, that was these debates rage, that those are the type of points that can be made. I'd like to ask you about how much money do we spend? You said it's 22% of the UN budget. How much is that altogether?
600 million.
600 million. And how much does China pay in their dues? Do we know?
A lot less. A lot less.
A lot less.
But I'm happy to get you that number.
Okay, well, I'm just saying that because I think that when we have a body like the United Nations and we're spending such a high proportion of their budget comes from us, and for us to be the whipping boy, or our friend, Israel, become the whipping boy, I think that is should be unacceptable. And I would, you can rest assured that those of us in this committee will be backing you up when you make such stands. My friend Chris Smith mentioned how sex and labor trafficking in China is something we have ignored up until now. And I would hope that these human rights issues do become part of President Trump's agenda. Let me note, and I think, by the way, we only have the last administration for 8 years to compare what Mr. Trump, what President Trump is doing. I think President Trump is doing a great job. He's doing a fantastic job. How many American presidents, instead of going, this American president went to Saudi Arabia and talked to the leaders of the Islamic world and said, if you want to be friends with the United States, drive the terrorists out of your mosque. I've never been more proud of a president since Ronald Reagan said, tear down this wall. And I think it was equivalent to that. So I would hope that those people who are just anti this president are trying to play politics with it. And just one last note. Russia is a flawed country, is a flawed state. I will just have to say that we should be making overtures to see if Russia can help us bring peace in the Middle East, especially in Syria, rather than trying to basically alienate Russia more and more and more, because there are bad guys. The Syrians aren't the only bad guys in that region. Many of our own allies are just as dictatorial and bad as Assad is. So let's hope that we can try to establish a more positive relationship with Russia that will help bring peace to that part of the world and help all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'll do this very quickly. I will continue to be a thorn in Maduro's side when it comes to Venezuela. I will continue to do that for human rights in any country that is an abuser of that. In terms of Russia, I agree with you. General Mattis continues to work with Russia because we do need to work with them on Syria, and we can work with them on counterterrorism. And so we're trying to find the places where we can work with them, but we're going to call them out in places that we have to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Albio Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to just say to my friend, my colleague from South Carolina, a great introduction. I just have a question. Which job did you like better, being in South Carolina as the governor or being in the Big Apple in New York?
Ask
I'm
me,
only kidding.
ask
No,
me
you
in
have to answer
6
that.
months. Ask me in 6 months.
Madam Ambassador, you know, I think some of us are frustrated. I did not grow up in this country. I grew up in a country where, you know, the Soviet Union just basically tried to indoctrinate everybody on the destruction of this country. How this is the worst country in the world, how we have to destroy democracy. And I guess the frustration that we have is that the president doesn't seem to share that view. He doesn't seem to speak strongly enough on what Russia is doing, interfering with the democracy of this country, how he's trying to undermine this country, how he's trying to basically destroy what we stand for. Seems that everybody around him certainly speaks enough about it, but he is the biggest voice. You have a great voice, but he is a lot bigger. And I wish, he'll come and say, look, this is happening. They did meddle. They did try to undermine our democracy. And I think that's part of our frustration. The other thing I want to commend you on, keep raising the human rights issue. And I promised the state troopers in New Jersey that I was going to raise this issue, of Joanne Chesimard, who shot a state trooper in New Jersey and has fled to Cuba and has been living there as a hero for the last 4 years. If you could talk to the president, mention to him that we want this criminal back so we can continue the justice. So if you can talk a little bit about that, and obviously Venezuela, I'm very concerned about Venezuela. I saw a tape last night where one of the police officers shot through a fence a young boy, just point blank. I mean, it is, horrible. And the last thing is, I don't know how you walk through the halls of United Nations. The hypocrisy there is just beyond. When you have human rights leaders in that commission who are some of the worst offenders in the world. So if you can just talk a little bit about that.
I can. In terms of Russia, the only thing I can tell you is that I have done a strong share of Russia bashing while I have been at the UN. The president has not called me once and said to stop it, and has not in any way told me, don't bash Russia. So I hope that you will understand that he very well could have, but he hasn't. In reference to the Cuban criminal, yes, I'm on it. I will make sure that we do something and see what we can do to get the administration. The administration's been very good about getting people home, and it's something that's on a priority, so I will also work and make sure that that is on our list. Venezuela, huge concern in every way. I can't bring enough attention to what the Venezuelan people are going through and how we're seeing more and more aggression by Maduro. If you heard his speech yesterday, he very much is saying he's going to use military action. He's very much saying that he's going to get more aggressive, and he's blaming the protesters for trying to overthrow his government when all they want is true democracy on that front. And then in the UN, we work, it's just like you work here. I have to work with certain people, and on some issues we agree, and on some issues we don't. But I have a loud voice on both of those. So when it's time to work with China, I do. But at the Human Rights Council, I called out China. I called out Saudi Arabia. I called out Cuba and Venezuela. And so I'll continue to do that, because what we try not to do is isolate anyone. We try and make sure where we can work with them, we do. But we're not shy about calling them out when we need to.
Ambassador, do we have any kind of a plan in case Maduro moves into using the military? And I think he's in the final stage of just, becoming a dictator. He already is. But I think it's going to just get worse. Do we have any plans? Are we talking to any members around? Because I think you're going to have an exodus. You're going to have people leaving. Already, I know Panama has told me that they're having a lot of people coming over. Colombia has a lot of. Yeah. So do we have any plans?
So I think there's plans in a couple of places. One, we brought it up at the Human Rights Council. The second thing, we were hoping for OAS. We didn't see that. I'm going to continue to push the Security Council. I would welcome any support that y'all can give in terms of that. But I think now we have to go back to the Security Council and do something about it there. Because, and the U.S. is also reviewing the policy there on what we would do if this got worse. So I know within our National Security Council meetings that we have, Venezuela is very much coming up on the radar as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Ambassador, for being here today. I had the pleasure of meeting you in the Capitol building for the first time last week when you met with a number of members, and thank you for your time then, and thank you for your time now. And a whole lot of us have been very impressed with what we've seen and heard thus far since you've entered into your current position. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
At this important time in our history. I'm going to repeat to some degree, first of all, what a number of other members have expressed as a big concern of theirs. It is mine as well, and that's the UN Human Rights Council. It seems that they spend an inordinate amount of time, it seems like most of their time really, criticizing one of our most important allies, Israel. And as you know, you recently stated to the Council quote, it is essential that this council address its chronic anti-Israel bias if it is to have any credibility, unquote. And I certainly agree with you in that respect. And I'd perhaps even go further. I don't know if it's possible for them to gain credibility after the waste of time that they've spent criticizing Israel. So I'd again welcome your input, anything you'd like to tell us on that issue.
Thank you. And I had referred to the Human Rights Council before. The reason I went to Geneva was very much to say it to them and not just send a statement from New York. And we just said for the United States to be involved in the Human Rights Council, they have to give us a reason to be. Because right now, we're going to be for human rights. It's either going to be inside or outside the council. What you saw was a lot of other countries are embarrassed by Agenda Item 7. They get that it discredits them, and they understand something needs to happen. What they have suggested is that it is Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Pakistan that continue to use Agenda Item 7. We are now going to try and work with those three and see what we can do to get that to stop, because I think that's incredibly important. But I also think we need to have competitive elections. You know, when you've got Cuba and Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and China and all of these on the Human Rights Council, there's something very wrong. And what it has become over the years is a place that bad actors go to sit to keep the sunlight from shining on them. It very much embarrasses these countries when human rights is brought up. And it's very much the reason they don't want me to bring it up in the Security Council, but I will continue to do that. So that's why we have a decision to make. And we will see if they make any proactive changes to the Human Rights Council, and then we'll decide whether the U.S. is better to be in it or off of it. But that's the dilemma that we're still going through.
Thank you. I agree with you completely. Let me turn now to Korea. We have 28,000 approximately U.S. troops there. And as we all know, they had elections recently, and they have a new president who tends to be more on the left than the previous government was. And one of his first acts was to suspend deployment of the THAAD missile defense, which I think was a big mistake. But they have put, I think, our troops at risk. And President Trump, said as much recently when he said he didn't feel that our troops were safe there. And it would seem to me that we ought to give South Korea a choice. They have the choice of having the most sophisticated missile defense system, the THAAD system, to defend them and to defend our troops. So they get the missile system and our troops, or they have no missile defense and no U.S. troops. I think it ought to be a very clear choice to them, and they need to face that choice head on. I think it really is irresponsible for us to allow our troops. It's different when we didn't have that capability. We had troops there for many years, and the North Koreans were always a threat. We have troops all around the world that are at risk. But I think it's an unreasonable risk when we have the ability now to defend those troops. And that government, in cooperation with us, could defend those troops much more effectively. And I would welcome your comment on that.
So I think that is something that what we saw was Moon was very cautious going into it, but he has actually made good strides towards us and away from North Korea on many levels. And, you know, those missiles that continue to be tested continue to push him the other way. I do think he was trying to slow walk that to see where it was going to be. I also think he's getting pressure from China to get rid of that. China is the number one country pushing them to get the THAAD system out. At the end of the day, I personally believe it's going to work itself out, but I also know that the administration, the second we see something that's not going in the favor of protection of our troops, then I know the president will act.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Welcome.
Good morning.
Welcome, Madam Ambassador. Glad to have you here today. You indicated that the budget was making a point more than it was a serious intention in and of itself. What point was being made by zeroing out funding for UNICEF, an organization highly praised, had a lot to do with saving millions of children's lives around the world with child nutrition programs, rehydration programs for diarrheal diseases, and the like. Highly lauded, not political. Why would we zero it out? What point was being made in that budget?
So I think that what you saw in the budget was it was trying to put the UN on notice. It wasn't about the specific organizations as much as it was putting them on notice. I can tell you that I have seen UNICEF in action when I went to Jordan and Turkey, and to see the schools and what they do is highly valuable. I believe I'm a conduit between what the president's budget did and where you end up. So I'm happy to give any information on what's working, what's not working, or what I see as valuable.
Madam Ambassador, I've been doing budgets up here and in my local government for over 30 years. When you zero something out, you're not making a point. You're making a profound statement and judgment about the value of that enterprise. To zero out UNICEF seems to me to be something that is not a particularly proud value that Americans would uphold.
Well, I can tell you that as governor, I also had a budget, and an executive budget very much is a conversation point. It's a starting point, and then you work with your legislature to bring those two together. And so I think what you have is that the president was trying to make a point to build up our military. Yes, it ended up going to where it had certain cuts there.
I don't think you want to go there.
I'm sorry?
I don't think you want to go there. So the president was making a point, we need to build up our military, and people who need to pay the price for that are children around the world who are at risk of malnutrition.
I know that that having conversations with the president on this budget and where Congress ends up, there is working room. There is room where I know that he would want to support UNICEF.
You're a loyal member of the administration. Good for you. Zeroing out UNICEF makes no sense to me, and it's not making a point. You said members up at the UN are just so glad we're, quote, leading again, unquote. Are those the same members who have condemned President Trump's ripping up of the TPP and renouncing the Paris Agreement? I'm looking at some close allies, some of whom are members of the Security Council, like France and not Germany, but Germany, certainly weren't praising America's leadership on those things.
Well, I can tell you, again, as a governor, with that Paris Agreement, the number of regulations it put on our businesses, the number of things it did with me trying to recruit international companies and how that
I wasn't
slowed
asking
down.
that question, Master. I'm sorry,
No,
I
I'm
only have
trying
5
to-
minutes.
I'm
My
trying to
question
answer
was
the
whether your colleagues at the UN were praising those decisions as that's America leading again. I'm quoting your words.
The U.S. has to make decisions that are in the best interest of the U.S. It is not in the best interest for our businesses or our industries. We are not going to throw the climate out the window. We're going
Well,
to continue to manage that.
I'm glad to hear
You may not
that.
agree with how we manage that, but I will tell you that I think what the president did was in the best interest of businesses, and it was in the best interest of the country, and that does not mean we are not going to be good stewards of the
Well,
climate.
that would come as news
And
to
we
a lot
don't
of big
want-
businesses that
We don't want
endorsed it.
China and Russia telling us how we need to handle our climate. I think that it's very much. a point
Excuse me,
that
we helped initiate the Paris Agreement. They didn't put a gun to our heads at all.
But it didn't go through the Senate, and
Well,
it didn't get passed.
Well,
by
it's
the
a
Senate.
proud moment that we're joining 2 other countries in the international community, Nicaragua and Syria.
We're being
It must be a
independent.
proud moment.
We're being independent.
Can I ask you, finally, what instructions have you been given about Russia? Presumably you talked to your Russian counterparts about Syria, right?
I talked to my Russian counterparts about a lot of things.
But not their interference with U.S. elections. That's off limits.
I mean, what would you want me to say to them? I'm at the UN. We're working on international issues. I have made it public that I do believe they interfered with our elections. I've also said we can't have any country interfere in our elections, and I stand by that.
I understand, but you now hold a very important diplomatic position at the United Nations. The Russians are at the United Nations. We talk about a panoply of issues, as you just indicated. But why wouldn't we, have you received any instructions at all with respect to their meddling in our elections? Like, don't talk about that, Ambassador Haley.
It hasn't come up.
It's never come up.
At the United Nations,
No, I'm talking about from Washington. Have you received instructions from the State Department? Don't talk about that.
no.
any instructions at all about it.
None. I have said what I've said. I've been on the record, and no one has said you're out of line. No one has said don't do anything. I mean, what I appreciate is this administration does not tell me what to say or what not to say. They allow me to say what I think, and they support me through that.
Thank you.
Go to Mr. Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for restoring American leadership to the United Nations. We saw, and thank you for participating in the National Security Forum as well as Senator Rubio and myself. I chair the Homeland Security Committee, and over the previous administration, over the last 6 years, I saw the caliphate expand and expand, and nothing was done to stop it. And external operations have been launched out of that region, and now it's become the epicenter for terrorism and the epicenter of probably the greatest humanitarian crisis that we have seen, with millions of refugees in Turkey and in Jordan, as you know, and throughout Europe, which poses a risk as well. I'm very proud of this administration's efforts now to crack down on this terrorist organization. But in the meantime, as we did nothing, Russia went into Syria to get the ports on the Mediterranean. Iran is now in the region. So my question is very simple. What is your strategy to deal with this very, very complicated situation?
I think that it's changing by the day. I think we literally are watching the Syria situation change by the day. I will tell you that I visited Jordan and Turkey recently just to make sure, as well as Israel, on that Syrian border, to see what the migration was doing, to see exactly how we were dealing with Syrian refugees and how the host countries were dealing with it. Jordan and Turkey have been phenomenal to their refugees. They see it as their duty. What we saw in Jordan is they're giving education, they're giving health care, they're giving a stipend. They do it on a bank card, and whether that refugee goes to a bank or to a grocery store, it's by iScan. They have 0% fraud. And so it's impressive to see what's happening there. Turkey doing very much the same things, but they actually have their Turkish doctors training the Syrian doctors in 3 months so that the Syrian doctors can take care of Syria. If you look, Jordan's taken in 1 million refugees, Turkey's taken in 3 million refugees, but they are feeling the pressure. They're double shifting schools. Jordanians and Turkish children are going in the mornings, Syrians are going in the afternoons. Competition for jobs is starting to be there, but the Syrians are very grateful. They're very entrepreneurial. If you look in the camps, they're creating their own economy with battery repair and alterations and all these types of businesses. So we need to support the host countries because they are doing
if I could just applaud your actions against Assad and what his use of chemical weapons to kill children in a hospital. But as long as he remains in power, propped up by Russia and Iran, this civil war will continue to go on, and that is the root cause of this whole problem, and it won't end, and the refugee humanitarian crisis won't end until I think that problem is dealt with.
Well, and I think that from the political situation of Syria, what you're looking at is I think that we are certainly making a lot of strides of getting ISIS out. I think it's been aggressive. I think it's going faster than we expected. From that standpoint, it's good. The Iranian influence in Syria is a problem. It's going to continue to be a problem because they're completely backing Assad. Russia's completely backing Iran. And so we're trying to make that separation because that needs to happen. I think the U.S., one of the best things we did was after the chemical weapons program, when the president made that decision to go in and strike, it sent shockwaves throughout the international community, as well as in Syria, to let them know we weren't going to stand for it. And I think the president's held true to any signs of chemical weapon usage. We're going to get involved. Now we're going to have to start looking as a country is what is the U.S. role going to be post-ISIS when ISIS gets out? Because a healthy Syria is not with Assad. You can't have Assad in power with a healthy Syria. And so I think we have to look at it from all levels and realize that a post-ISIS Syria doesn't mean all goes back to where it should be happy and good again. We have to make sure it doesn't stay vulnerable for other terrorists.
Well, it's good to finally see some leadership in that part of the world. And I will say that the Iranians are wedded to Assad. I'm not sure the Russians quite are.
I think they're starting to see him as a liability.
And I think there is an opportunity possibly
Yes.
to work with them to have a graceful exile of Mr. Assad.
I agree with you.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
We go now to Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
Welcome, Ambassador Haley. Before
Thank you.
asking questions, I just wanted to make one request, if I may. I represent Bob Levinson, who's been missing in Iran for 10 years. I would implore you, at every opportunity you might have to see anyone from the Iranian delegation, or when you speak with our allies who speak with the Iranians, please press for his return to his family. I want to, again, thanks for being here, and I'm grateful for what you've said this morning and your presence at the UN these past 5 months. Your willingness to speak out forcefully there and here in support of human rights is really welcome. At times, your advocacy for human rights agenda seems to be at odds with some other members of the administration who don't seem to place the same value on human rights in the center of our policy agenda where it belongs, as you do, and the lack of coordinated messaging has at times left our friends and allies around the world confused and questioning, and I imagine it has at times made your job challenging. But I commend you for what you do. I commend you for convening the first special session on human rights during the month that the U.S. held the presidency of the Security Council. It is important to do what you're doing. We're able to shine a light on human rights abuses. You're able to push for peacekeeping reform. You're able to urge for greater efficiency in refugee assistance because the U.S. is fully engaged at the UN. And while the UN is far from perfect, and we can all acknowledge that, if we retreat from it, instead of working from within to improve it, we will cede leadership to those whose goals and interests run counter to our own. American leadership is what helps to prevent global health crises and address food insecurity. It's what helps address instability in dangerous places. Diplomacy and development helps to prevent wars. So I hope that you will continue to speak out, and this Congress will fully fund our commitment to these efforts. I agree with the concerns that you've laid out. I have spoken out forcefully about the pervasive anti-Israel obsession at the Human Rights Council, and no country has been subject to more resolutions than Israel, but it's also true that since the U.S. re-engaged on the Council, the number of Israel-specific resolutions has decreased. And it is, as you point out this morning, it's hard to take the Human Rights Council seriously when some of the world's worst human rights abusers sit on the Council in an effort to shield themselves from criticism. But if we walk away from the Council and give those bad actors free rein to continue to make a mockery out of human rights, we will all be the worse off for it. And I hope that we will stick with it so that you can continue to make the case. You raised two possible reforms, membership standards and the removal of Agenda Item 7. On membership standards, I wonder if you could tell us how the team in Geneva is working to advance that. Specifically, are you laying out criteria for membership, and how can we help you with that? And then secondly, on Agenda Item 7, it's my understanding that procedurally the next time it can come up is on the agenda, that the agenda can be changed is 2021. But earlier you mentioned that in your discussions with other countries, you singled out Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan as the only ones who will not acknowledge the absurdity of having a dedicated agenda item for a democratic ally of ours on the Human Rights Council agenda, while completely ignoring the abuses, the human rights abuses in Iran and North Korea and Venezuela. So my question to you on that is, given that those countries are the ones who object, and given that this administration at this moment has a lot on the table with those countries, have you spoken to the administration about using all of its resources with the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Pakistanis to help them understand why it's in their best interest to partner with us to make the Human Rights Council a place that actually can be respected? And if so, what steps have they taken?
Okay, thank you. In reference to Bob Levinson, we'll never let that go. I mean, that's something that I think sits on the hearts of many Americans wanting to see him and his family reunited. And so, yes, we're going to continue to keep up the pressure on that. In terms of the budget, I want to be a conduit in any way I can as you make your decisions on where the budget needs to go, and let you know what I've found to be valuable, what I think is important. And we will continue to be a leader at the UN. I strongly believe that. And so we just need to decide what those areas are, and we'll continue to do that. In reference to the Human Rights Council, yes, we talked about competitive elections, because typically what happens is by the time the region decides who that person's going to be, they're already on the ballot and there's no contest. So we've got to look at the contest before. It's going to require more engagement, but it's going to have to be willingness by others. We know it can be done because Russia lost last time, and they lost because of their participation in Ukraine. So we've just got to kind of learn from that and say, okay, how do we continue to bring those things up? So we are working not only with the Human Rights Council itself, but we're also trying to engage in the General Assembly and maybe seriously look at using UNGA in September to bring that more to light and see what we can do there. I know Agenda 7 doesn't come up until 2021. We're not going to wait that long. So our goal is to go ahead and start doing this now, because there are ways we could do it now. I've talked with the Secretary General about it. I've talked with the Human Rights Council about it. I have talked to members of the administration. This will be multi-level in us trying to do that. Secretary Tillerson and I have discussed what pressure we need to put on what countries. And so, yes, we're going to take that from all angles that we can.
Thank you.
Jeff Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I sat here this morning, I'm reminded of, and I want to remind the committee, that President Obama's State Department sent $350,000 in taxpayer-funded grants to an organization called One Voice in Israel to influence the election or the ouster of Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2015. Ambassador Haley, you're doing a great job. Thanks for being here today. You know, on my side of the aisle, I'm one that believes that foreign aid is a powerful tool in U.S. foreign policy. And I get a little more than chagrin when recipients of large amounts of U.S. foreign aid don't vote with the United States at least half the time in the UN. If you really look at the voting records of countries like Haiti, which was a huge recipient of U.S. foreign aid, and back when I did the research in, I think, 2012, they were voting with us like 18% of the time. If you really go through the list of countries that receive billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars, this is money from hardworking American taxpayers that we're giving away to foreign countries that can't even vote with us, their benefactor, at least half the time in the UN. I know you're aware of that. Some have speculated their efforts to whip the votes at the UN to try to get our beneficiaries to vote with us aren't as good as our adversaries. Do you support the position that, you know, we ought to have beneficiaries of taxpayer dollars vote with us more at the UN?
So I will tell you that the one point I continue to make at the UN is the U.S. will not be taken for granted. And you cannot take the fact that this money that's always been rolling to you is going to continue to roll to you. So yes, we've put them on notice when it comes to that. I do think we very much have a partnership that we can have with Congress, because we need to make sure they understand it's not just give me the money and then turn around and go against things that really matter to us on the other side. And coordinating that is something we very much want to start doing at the UN in terms of getting to see if we can push votes that way. And happy to work with you on that. But yes, I think it's very important that we always want to do what is in the best interest to help people. We've always had, you know, a moral, we've always kind of been the moral compass to the world. But we are not going to be rolled over anymore at the UN. We are not going to allow that to happen. Every dollar matters, and we don't have to give it. And if we do, other countries just need to respect that and understand that and not vote against us on things that they know that in turn will help them. So yes, I absolutely think you're right on that.
Well, thank you for that. I've had the same conversation with countries that are a part of the OAS with regard to Venezuela, that don't seem like they can vote with the United States and with democracy-loving countries as the OAS does different things, not really sanctions at this point, toward Venezuela. I think it's a conversation to have. Let me ask you about, we're seeing since the Colombia-FARC negotiations and the peace deal that was implemented there, as chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, the next thing to look at is going to be the increase in coca production and cocaine trafficking out of Colombia. I believe Colombia took their eye off the ball with regard to the cartel, and even the FARC trying to grow a lot of coca increased cocaine production to put some money in the bank before they became a legitimate political power. So under that peace agreement. Is there anything at the UN, any conversations being had about cocaine trafficking, increase in Colombia and Peru, and what we can do as a community to stop drug trafficking?
Okay, first of all, to kind of go back to your last comment, I would remind you that we give quite a bit of money to the Palestinian Authority directly, bilaterally, and any leverage you can do on getting them to stop those martyr payments is going to be very important. And if you can make that correlation and use that as a conversation point, that would be very helpful to me. In terms of the FARC, we saw that the weapons turned over yesterday. We had a good announcement there in terms of things are starting to move. The Security Council does have a one-year mandate in Colombia to sit there and look at all of those things. And in that, it is obviously to bring up the health and the effectiveness of how to make Colombia strong. So yes, those will be one of the things we're doing. You also know we have our South Carolina National Guard that is partners with Colombia as well. And so I think you're right to see past the FARC and see where it's going from there to look at the future of Colombia. And so we'll be happy to partner with you on that as well.
Okay. Yeah, I visited with the National Guard folks in Colombia, and very proud of what they're doing with Colombia and that partnership. I know you were part of that as well as General Livingston. So thank you for that. Good luck, and thanks for being here. God bless you.
Thank you.
Karen Bass of California.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Madam Ambassador. I want to congratulate your leadership in your short tenure, and definitely register that I appreciated you bringing the Security Council to Washington, D.C., and including members of Congress. I would love to see that happen again, and I also look forward to continuing to work with you on South Sudan and famine. So I wanted to ask you questions primarily related to that. Given that the UN has declared that famine in the 4 countries as the world's worst humanitarian crisis since 1945, what concerns me the most is that it's the crisis that no one seems to know anything about. And I wanted to know specifically what the UN is doing to bring the crisis to the attention of the world. And you know, the last time there was a crisis like this in 2011 in Somalia, 200,000 people had to die before the world really took notice. The other thing is that our contribution of $990 million, we put that in the continuing resolution. I do have concerns, as I think Mr. Chairman Smith mentioned, that money gets out of the door as quick as possible, and that money not be rolled over into fiscal year 18, because that blows the entire point. The point was to respond to the crisis. And then, of course, I'm concerned about the budget proposed by the administration that would actually cut food aid. So when I look at this handout, and this handout is from USAID, and it talks about the funding gap. And, you know, we have made substantial contributions, but other donors still have quite a lot to contribute. And so I wanted to know your thoughts on how we might be helpful to you in terms of getting other donors to step up to the plate, including some non-traditional donors such as China and the Middle East.
Thank you, and I really do believe these 4 famine areas are extremely important, and we need to, if we really want peace and stability, we need to look at that. When it comes to the food aid, very important that we continue to work with USAID, but also with the World Food Program.
Yeah.
We now have, we made sure that we have an American leading that who happens to be a former South Carolina governor,
Yes.
David Beasley, and he has hit the ground running and is really starting to raise quite a bit of money for the World Food Program as well. But we need to continue to put pressure on other countries, because the Secretary General has raised the famine issue as something to be concerned about. We don't want people to get overly excited that South Sudan came off that list,
Right.
because the food insecurity is still very strong. And then there's the political issues. You've still got access issues of trying to get the food in. You've still got issues with South Sudan when it comes to that. When it comes to Yemen, we're watching the port very carefully. Hudaydah, we have to make sure that there's no problem with that port, or we will really be in a bad situation. And then when it comes to Nigeria and Somalia, just dealing with with al-Shabaab and Boko Haram are going to continue to be an issue as deterrences to getting the food in. So I think what's most important is that we continue to talk about it. Thank you, thank you, thank you for the $1 billion, because that was hugely important when it came to the famine relief, and I think we need to continue to do that, but it's also the reason I'm going there in the fall. So I can see it in terms of what else can the UN be doing, what else can the U.S. be doing in terms of helping with that situation.
Well, you know, when we did go, when Chairman Smith and I did go, even though famine has been rolled back in South Sudan, we did find that people are only getting enough food for half a month.
Yes.
So maybe it's that they're not dropping dead as quick, but, you know, they still are very much in a crisis. And then I hope, you know, you mentioned Mr. Beasley chairing the world, heading up the World Food Program, but yet our budget calls for cuts to that. And so I'm hoping that, you know, in your position, you can push back and encourage that those cuts not happen, because we don't have any reason in the world to think that we're not going to be facing famine next year until we address the root causes of the famine, which is the conflict. And then just on a final note at the end of my time, you know, I know that there's a lot of interest in getting countries that disagree with us to vote with us, and I don't know where you measure that. And I would hate to think that the U.S. would move in a position of saying we're going to withhold aid unless you vote, what, 10%, 15%, 100%? How do you measure, you know, how do you measure that? And I think that would be a very bad precedent and direction to us to go forward. So I look forward to continuing to work with you, and maybe we can speak before you head off to South Sudan the next time.
Yes, no hard percentages on what funding should happen. I think that we just look at each individual one, and where we see a bad actor that's not relating well with the Palestinians, to get them to stop those murder payments is so important, and I think it creates a conversation for y'all to have to help encourage that. But yes, we're not looking at hard cuts in terms of that, and I continue to tell the President what is valuable and what is not. And so things like UNICEF and World Food Program and the famine issues are things that I have talked with him about and will continue to talk to him about. And I think that's why we can be the conduit between the President and Congress on where that final budget ends up.
Okay, it's great to be in the chair with Ambassador Haley here. Chair will now go to Mr. Perry for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
Ambassador, great to see you. On behalf of all the Americans that feel as I do that we're tired of seeing America be the whipping post, we're very proud of your service and the service of our President of the United States, and let me just state that. And then with your indulgence, I just want to address what I think is political theater here. So while it's interesting, I and the American people may marvel at the left's newfound concern regarding Russian/communist socialist nations' continued efforts to diminish America. I just want to remind everybody about the FDR administration, Alger Hiss, John Service, Harry Hopkins, who served at the very highest levels of government, and what seems to be the left's continued and being enamored with Russia, Cuba, Che Guevara, et cetera, from FDR to the previous president's statements to then President Medvedev. And I just got a news flash for everybody. Russia, communists, the socialists have always meddled in America, have always targeted us, and they're going to continue to do that. So welcome to the fight. With that, Ambassador, I have a question which I'm going to put up front just for you to think about, and then I'm going to buttress it a little bit here. I'm working on some legislation to prevent U.S. taxpayers from funding UNRWA, right, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, and I want to get your thoughts on that in a general way as it currently exists. And the context is this. It's 67 years old, right, and I looked at their mission statement to establish a lasting peaceful end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through direct bilateral negotiations, and that's number one. Number two, counter Palestinian terrorist groups. Number three, establish the norms of democracy, accountability, and good governance. And when I look at, in that context, what we're dealing with now, and I'll just pick out a couple things, UNRWA's expansive definition of refugee, where President Abbas has acknowledged that that definition would mean the end of Israel. That's number one. Number two, the Hamas-affiliated affiliation with UNRWA, and the fact, I'll just give you a metric here, since 2006, Hamas-affiliated candidates have held 11 seats on the UNRWA Teachers Union Executive Board. And the UNRWA schools and use textbooks and materials that delegitimize Israel, denigrate Jews, and venerate martyrdom. Fully 78.6% of youth in Gaza and 46.4% of youth in the West Bank support the knife intifada. Furthermore, 76% of the terrorists taking part in the knife intifada were under the age of 30. And finally, I don't understand, and I'm not sure why anybody can explain to me, how they report directly to the General Assembly rather than the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. So it's been since 1950 that we've been paying for, I think we're currently up to about 31% of their budget for a temporary mandate. The United States is out of money. We're out of cash to throw around, right? We're $20 trillion in debt, $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. It seems like it's been long enough to fund something that can't even meet its mission. As a matter of fact, I think it'd be correct to say that it flies in the face and runs completely counter to every single one of the policy goals that was set up for. Yet the American hard-working taxpayer is paying for this thing. What are your thoughts, ma'am?
So I had thought a lot of what you said about UNRWA, but I wanted to see it for myself. And so when I went to Israel, I went to the Palestinian areas and looked at the UNRWA camp. We talked about the schools, we talked about the textbooks, we talked about the participation of Hamas and where things were going with that. And this is what I will tell you. Yes, UNRWA is not perfect. And yes, when it comes to any sort of relationship with Hamas, that needs to come out. They claim they are cleaning up the textbooks, but I think more work needs to be done on that front. The only reason why I would say don't eliminate UNRWA is because there is so much resentment between the Palestinians behind that fence and Israel that an uneducated Palestinian versus an educated Palestinian.
Okay, I'm going to push back just a moment, Ms. Ambassador.
I saw
so
this.
let me ask you this. This seems like a fair question. How much longer should folks like me wait on behalf of the American taxpayers until they clean up their act? I mean, it's been 67 years. How much longer should we wait?
I feel your frustration, and I think that what we need to figure out is what is the replacement of UNRWA, or how do we go back? First, we have to limit the number of refugees. It's out of hand, the number of people that UNRWA covers, because they're not all refugees. But the schooling and the health care for those groups in there, I mean, there's no other place for them to get it. And so there's a population there that does need to have that. All the points you raised are right, and all those are all things that we need to fix. But I just
My time has expired, Ms. Ambassador, but at a minimum, I think we ought to look at what their mission is, and if we can't meet this mission, then we ought to reestablish a new one, and I yield.
Gentleman's time's
I
expired.
understand.
I will now go down to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Ambassador,
Yes, good
thank you
morning.
for being here, and thank you for your service. The Office of UN Women, I think, is a very important office. It empowers and trains women's groups so that they can contribute to conflict resolution and peace building. It also deals with an issue that this committee has been very involved in terms of having women be active as a participant in counterterrorism implementation and dealing with that implementation task force. Make sure that gender is addressed in counterterrorism strategies. It's also involved, among many other things, in fighting violence against women, engaging women in protecting women themselves, and providing resources to women who are victims of violence. You said the President's budget is there to make a point. What point did the President make by zero funding this office?
Well, you know, my job is to go through and look and see what the office does, whether it's valuable, what the U.S. role should be in, and then report back. And so that's what I plan on doing.
Do you think it's valuable, that office?
We'll find out. I mean, I think I need to do more work, but yes, overall, anything that empowers women, creates a healthy situation for women, works for girls, does any of those things, yes, it sounds good on the surface, but we're going through all of those, whether it's like UNESCO or whether it's any of these programs that we have. We're going to continue to look at
What is the time frame for going through now this? And can you enlighten us in terms of a time frame where perhaps this office will know it's going to continue to exist and go forward?
I mean, I think you can expect in short term. I mean, we're going through all of these. It's only been 5 months, so we're trying to cover as much as we can at the UN, and I'm happy to report back and let you know what we find out and whether it's valuable, and it's something I would let the President know as well.
Thank you. This committee has been very involved in trying to empower women and deal in that area itself, so it's something that I would appreciate in short term.
We will get back to you
getting
on
back
that,
to you.
yes.
Secondly, you know, we talked about staffing in State Department in particular, and all those areas that haven't been staffed. And I wonder, in your working with State, has that made it difficult to communicate back and forth for you and your function? And just to give a sense of things, do you have a lot of opportunity to deal directly with Secretary Tillerson and coordinate and have conversations? How frequently do you have the opportunity to converse or stay in touch?
So because I'm a cabinet member, I primarily work with General McMaster at the NSC, and so we work with his staff quite a bit. With the hirings at the State Department, you know, we have nothing to do with that, so I've focused on the hirings at USUN. We have, up until now, saved $500,000 compared to this time last year just by cutting overtime and trips and, you know, certain things, but our experts there are fantastic.
But it hasn't inhibited you in terms of your communication with the Secretary or back and forth, that lack of staffing?
You know, I work more with the NSC than I do with the State Department.
I see. Do you have occasion to work with the President's senior advisor because he's so involved in, right now, in Middle East issues? Mr. Kushner, have you talked and engaged with him? How frequently do you talk to Mr. Kushner about these international problems?
It depends on what issues he's working on, but I've talked to him certainly before I went to Israel to look at the UN programs. I always download them on what the trips are. They let me know if there's any issues. But with the UN, I primarily work with Secretary Tillerson or General McMaster, but if Jared has a certain question or certain issue that he wants to discuss, then he will call me.
What is your view of his role?
I think that, you know, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, I think he's being very effective in terms of, when I was there, there's hope. I felt it, both sides realize they've got to come to the table. Both sides realize something needs to happen. I think he's handled it respectfully, and I think he's handled it aggressively. So that's really the one thing I've worked with him on. And I think that on any other issues that he works on, I'm not as sure because we don't have as much. I know that he was very involved in the trip that the President made you know, to the area, and that was extremely effective because I was in the area and it was very well received.
Well, thank you. I just had one other quick question because my time is running out.
Yes.
With Qatar and the blockade, what's your position on that? There seems to be conflicting positions within the administration.
I see it as an opportunity. We should take it as the opportunity that it is. It's a good chance to tell Qatar, quit funding Hamas, quit doing these things in Gaza that they're doing. You know, let them know that they have been funding groups that are going towards that terrorist activity we don't want to see, but at the same time, go back to Saudi Arabia and say, look, you can talk to them, but at the same time, you've got to cut this out. You've got to stop doing this. It's an opportunity to kind of hit on both of them, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming here, and I hope we have the opportunity to have you back here again. I appreciate your service. I yield back.
Ron DeSantis of Florida.
Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Before you assumed your position, the UN passed Resolution 2334, really disastrous resolution, frontal attack on Israel. What is your understanding about the role that your predecessor played in facilitating that?
Well, I made sure to every member of the Security Council to let them know what a kick in the gut 2334 was to the people of the United States.
And was that view a change from what they had been told previously with the previous administration?
There was some who were apologetic. There were some that were resentful. There were some that acted indifferent. But yes, they did let me know that this was U.S.-led and U.S.-pushed, and that only made it worse.
No doubt. So the question is that, do we have an opportunity to repeal that or reverse that? And if not, why should the American taxpayer fund an organization that, of their 24 resolutions, 20 of them were dealing with this one tiny, the only Jewish state, the State of Israel?
I can tell you it's been nothing short of abusive what has happened to Israel. And the only thing I can compare it to, it's like the kid bullied in the playground. They did it to make themselves feel better. They did it because it was in habit. They did it because they could. I think that what I will tell you is we put them on notice the very second I went to my first hearing because I could not believe how abusive it was.
So you think the American taxpayer has a right to expect changes at the UN in order to continue to
and
send
they
money?
all know not to talk about 2334. Very hard to repeal now that it's done. But what we will do is call them out anytime this happens, and we have seen a decrease in that rhetoric. And in this last Israel bashing session, which they do every month and have for the last 10 years, it was the first time that they actually, the majority of the members, just pushed the peace process instead of bashing Israel. So there is a change, but there's a long way to go.
And I appreciate your leadership. We also can take other actions. The president, when he campaigned, promised to move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I've gone over there, looked at sites. It can be done. Do you support doing that? And are we going to eventually do that?
I've always supported the embassy move, and I believe the president supports it as well. It's not about if it happens, it's about when.
But I hope it's soon, because I think it would be great if we could do it now. There's an issue of we have Americans that were born in Jerusalem. When they go to get passports, the State Department does not allow them to write Israel, Jerusalem, Israel, because they claim that that's disputed and it's not the capital of Israel. Can we get relief for some of those? I mean, would you favor that, allowing Americans born in Jerusalem to just have Jerusalem, Israel, if they so choose, on their passports?
I'm not aware of that, but I'm happy to talk to the State Department about that and see what it would take.
Muslim Brotherhood, is that part of the solution in the Middle East or part of the problem in the Middle East in your view? And if it's the latter, should the U.S. designate them as a foreign terrorist organization?
So I think that that's highly debated. That is not something that has been discussed within the administration. I am not a fan of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so I do think that they are more problematic in the area than helpful.
Because I think that we hit the terrorists, kind of whack-a-mole, which is good. You got to take them out. But there's a foundational ideological view that is motivating that, and there will be other people who will fill that vacuum. The Brotherhood, I think, represents the foundation, and if we can deal with that, then I think we're dealing with the problem of radical Islamic terrorism much more holistically and likely to be more effective.
I completely agree with you.
Turkey, are they a valuable part of NATO at this point? There was a disastrous display here in Washington where Erdogan's goons are beating American protesters. You've seen a country that used to be a bridge to the West has turned in a much more Islamist direction. Our relationship with Turkey, is it strained? What's the viability of them as a NATO ally if they seem to be going in a direction that's different from the Western values that the rest of the NATO allies hold?
So a few things with Turkey. It's complicated, but when I was in Turkey, I did meet with the foreign minister. It was mainly focused on how to get access into Syria because they were stopping some of the NGOs from getting in there. But we talked about multiple other things, prisoner releases and some other things along those lines. Turkey is a fantastic host country to the Syrians. They are doing everything right by the Syrians. Their government is starting to turn for the worse. You can start to see more of a dictatorship that's starting to happen, those types of things. I work very closely with the Turkish ambassador because with everything going on, we need to. They are not happy with what we have done with the YPG, but they get it. They don't like it, but they get it. And so I think Turkey's one of those that it's got its good sides, it's got its bad sides. It has been made clear to them at the highest level that you can't come to our country and act like that. At the highest level. They know that that's not something we will tolerate. They know that it was very much frowned upon. They have given excuses as to why it happens, and they know we're not taking any of their excuses.
Thank you.
Ami Bera of California.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, for the Indian American diaspora, this is probably a first, and obviously proud for the community. Madam Ambassador, when we think about the UN Security Council, it's been a consistent policy from the past administration, also I think with the current administration, to do necessary reforms and modernize the UN Security Council. And can we get, obviously the politics at the UN aren't going to be easy, but in the statement released earlier this week, the President reaffirmed his commitment to add India as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, along with what I would argue we should include all of the G4 nations. And is that something that we can get your commitment to continue to work on?
Well, I have told all members of the UN that we are in support of Security Council reform as long as they don't take our veto away. You know, that's been very important. So, yes, I know that there's multiple different plans out there and things that are going on. We're going to continue to engage and continue to talk about that.
Great, thank you. In your earlier comments, you noted that the budget was making a point as opposed to being reality. My colleague, Mr. Connolly, talked a little bit about what UNICEF does, and you yourself, in answering one of his questions, talked about how you've seen firsthand how what they do is incredibly valuable. Can we get your commitment as you're working behind the scenes with the administration, with the President? We'll do our part to push to restore full funding or as much funding as possible. Can we get your commitment that that is a priority?
I think that we need to, remind these organizations that they too need to smartly spend, and they need to look at their budgets as well, as we're all kind of looking at how we can be smarter about what we do. But yes, I absolutely will support UNICEF. It's something that I'm happy to continue to talk to you about that one and other organizations that we found helpful, but I'm also talking with the administration about it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Another organization that was zeroed out was UN Family Planning Agency. Their priority and their mission is to prioritize the health and education and needs of women and girls around the world. If you look at their core work, it's providing access to contraception, it's providing safe childbirth, it's addressing and responding to gender-based violence, it's advocacy against abusive practices like child marriage and female genital mutilation. You would agree that those are worthy causes to fight?
There are many causes that are important that affect women and children that we want to make sure that we keep that at the forefront. The problem with the UNFPA is they did have ties to China that does force sterilization. But I can tell you every ounce of that money is going to all the things you just talked about, but it'll be done through the general health programs through USAID.
Well, so I've got some concern because that's been brought up multiple times. Under the last Republican president, George W. Bush, State Department did do an examination to see if that was occurring, and they did not find that evidence that UNFPA was engaging in.
The gentleman yield on that point?
Well, I've only got a limited time, so.
Accurate.
That they were engaging in coercive abortion or involuntary sterilization. If that is in fact occurring, great, let's remove funding from those types of programs, or let's hold UNFPA accountable. But UNFPA is doing tremendous work around the world protecting maternal and child health, and I say that as a doctor. We shouldn't just throw everything out if there's a single program. I understand there's the Kemp-Kasten Amendment, and instead of just withdrawing all funding, a lot of women are going to suffer. There'll be unnecessary deaths and so forth. So, can I get your assurances that you'll look at these programs as opposed to just zeroing out and eliminating these programs? If there's evidence of coercion, if there's evidence of involuntary sterilization, great, address that, but let's not pull all of our funding.
That is, so on a lot of programs, yes, I'm happy to work with you on all of those. That is a decision that's already been made by the administration, so I don't anticipate a change in that, but I'm happy to at least let you know the information that they have.
Look, the administration already made a decision to zero out funding for UNICEF. That's a starting point, as you said. It's not necessarily an ending point. We can continue to put some of this pushback.
Well, and I think that was just a directive that we got, that was going to happen. We haven't had that on UNICEF and some other things, but what I will tell you is very important is the global health of women and children as we go forward. And so we have made sure that same money is going to global health programs to do the same things within the USAID. But I'm happy to get you any information I have as to what the administration's stance is on that.
Great, thank you.
Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Ambassador, it's great to see you here. It's refreshing to see you sitting there compared to where we saw last time. But I love your attitude because you're not serving a political party. You're not serving so much the administration as you're representing America the way it needs to be represented and its strong leadership, and I do thank you for that. Some members are still in denial that America is facing tough economic challenges coming. Austerity measures are coming, and so I am, for one, happy to see some of the cuts the President has offered because that leads to reform, and those reforms are what we need to make. Secretary Tillerson in Seoul declared the era of strategic patience towards North Korea has ended. In veterinary medicine, we have a comparable phrase, and it's called benign neglect, and that's hoping an illness will get better on its own. However, it doesn't work for a terminal disease, and that's what the situation in North Korea is, and we need to deal with it. So my directions are going to be towards China and China's help with correcting the problems. And are they a strategic partner or a strategic opponent? Because I think their actions speak louder than their words. You know, they say they want to help us, and what I see is doublespeak. If you look at what China has said they're going to help us with North Korea, they were going to put more pressure on them. But yet, you know, when they said they're not taking in any more coal, if you look at their iron ore imports from North Korea to China, it's up 270%. Their trade for North Korea in the first quarter of this year is up 37.4%. And so when you look at what China is doing, they're putting pressure and boxing Taiwan in. They've thrown them out of the World Health Assembly. And Taiwan was such a valuable partner in that. They're the ones that came up with the cures for the SARS epidemic, and they threw them out of that. They put pressure on Panama to take Taiwan out of that. They went against South Korea when we put the THAAD system in, and that was strictly defensive in nature. And so China is showing aggression in there, at the same time telling us that they're going to work with us, yet they take over the South China Sea and claim it all as theirs under the guise of peaceful navigational purposes. So it was great to see the FONOPS that we did, the freedom of navigation that the Navy did, and I hope we continue that with all nations in the South China Sea, because China speaks that they're going to help us, but yet the rhetoric isn't there. A detailed UN report issued in February of this year published the names and addresses of multiple UN-designated proliferators that have openly operated on Chinese soils for years. And since then, the Center for Advanced Defense have exposed China-based business networks as being behind the smuggling of record cargoes of North Korean weapons to the Middle East. So China is funding and allowing North Korea to gain access to these weapons, or they're producing them, selling them to the Middle East, going into the hands of terrorists fighting our troops. And so if China is really going to help us, my question to you is, why hasn't China been held accountable for the repeated violations and undermining of UN sanctions, and what tools does the UN have in your capacity to hold China accountable and ensure the sanctions are implemented? And two last things. I want you to look, I chair the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs, and I know we're separate branches of government, but I want to know where we can help you. And one of the things we did is put in the State Sponsors of Terror bill, and I would sure love to see North Korea put back on the State Sponsor of Terror so that we can enforce the secondary, tertiary sanctions on banks and businesses doing business with them. So if you could answer that question about China, thank you.
Yes, so first of all, China is, when it came to North Korea, I do think there was a good faith effort initially. We continued to put more pressure. They continued to move a little bit more. As the missile testing continued to happen, they actually publicly in China were saying some things about North Korea, and then all of a sudden North Korea pounced back. And at that point, we saw a calming down of China and pulling back again of China. I can tell you that they did when we proposed sanctions on North Korea and all the entities in those missile tests. They voted with us, and we were able to pass it because they voted with us. Are they doing enough on trade with North Korea? No. Laborers? No. Any of those other things? No. So the pressure we have put on has been strong. And I have said publicly, if we have to go to secondary sanctions, we will. And so we are not past holding anyone accountable when it comes to supporting or helping North Korea in what they're doing with the nuclear situation, and we will continue to push hard on that front.
Thank
and
you
I
for
think
your
that
service.
The President has
and
also
thanks
done.
for being here. And any way we can help you, let us know. Thank you.
Thank you, will do.
We go to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Hello.
Good
First, I
morning.
just want to thank you for your service. I have very high hopes and expectations for you, and I'm just urging you for you to remember that you represent all Americans, not just a president of the United States. I'm going to start with a little bit of a rant, and then I do have a question. I do not understand why our president wants to keep putting more money in defense, but yet reduce the funding for those elements of our security that would keep us from having to use our military. So, and that means I think that your efforts should be fully funded, obviously. I want to just say this, and I want to say it politely, because as I said, my purpose is to urge you to be a champion for the women of this world. I did not like your answer to my colleague's question about the defunding of the United Nations Population Fund, because you said, well, the administration has already made that decision. Well, I want to urge you to try to convince our president and administration to overturn that. You know, I know you would agree that for the world to be peaceful, that women need to be fully productive in their societies, not just reproductive, but productive. And that means they have access to health care. In our own country, our Constitution gives us the right to contraception and to legal abortion. And yet, we are making every effort to cut that off all over the world. We have the gag rule now. Now we have this defunding of the United Nations Population Fund, and with a totally phony excuse about something China's doing, which there's no proof of. So I want to know how you are going to fight to make sure that women have access to health care around this world.
Well, thank you. And I first want to say that I do believe this position I am serving every citizen in the country to try and have a strong voice for the United States. I will continue to do that, and I see that as my role and my job. I have a passion for not only women, but children in conflict. And so at every position, whether it was Jordan, whether it was Turkey, whether it was Israel, I always just meet with women. Now, I meet with others, but I do a separate sidebar with women to find out exactly what they care about. And so, for example, in Jordan and Turkey, the psychological support that they think they need and their children is a huge thing, and I'm trying to really push that we start to go to that psychosocial support in helping them. When it comes to family planning, we want to help with that as well.
How are you going to do it? And let me ask you, have you had a discussion with the administration about reversing their position on this health care funding?
Well, first of all, when it comes...
Would you have a discussion?
Of course. I've only been there 5 months. So understand that UNFPA, that was decided very early on. I have no problem looking into it. I have no problem checking to see what the reasonings were behind it.
Well, I'm just going to say something here. I think it's an urgent issue because I have to tell you that access to health care and reproduction is something that's occurring every single day. So you need to really do that. I have another question.
Just
for you.
one more point, if you don't mind.
Yes, please. Yes.
So keep in mind, the U.S. is not the only one that funds the UNFPA. We're actually the third largest donor to the UNFPA. So while I know that the U.S. has decided not to do that, those programs are not stopping because we do have other countries that are funding it. So I don't want you to think that that just goes away.
Okay, I just want to urge you, plead with you, please focus your attention on that. Next question, last question is, I know that the president has suggested that your budget be cut. Hopefully the Congress is not going to go along with that. I want to get a commitment from you. If if we fund the positions and we fund the efforts at the UN, the Congress that we feel is necessary, are you going to take the effort to hire the positions and make sure that the issues we're trying to fund are executed?
So I don't have anything to do with the State Department hires. That's different.
I'm asking you about your hires.
Yes, my hires, yes, we will continue to do that. And whatever budget you give me, I will work with.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.
I'm counting on you.
I know, and I will try and make you proud. Thank you.
Adam Kinzinger from Illinois.
Thank you for being here.
morning.
It's very, very appreciated. Thank you for your service. Thanks for spending the time with us and delving into a lot of important issues. Mr. Chairman, I'll point out the clock needs to be reset. Otherwise, I'll go on forever. Anyway, so just thank you for everything you've done and for being here. A lot of important issues we're discussing. I think there's no more important issue than Syria, which I know you've touched on. But when we look at world stability, when we look at the war on terror, when we look at American safety, I think it's important that Americans understand that what goes on in Syria affects us here, and that the brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad, backed up by the Iranians, backed up by the Russians that are bombing hospitals with GPS or precision-guided munitions, secondary strikes against the same hospitals, are actually creating a whole new generation of terrorists. In fact, there are some in this body that buy into the argument that strongmen somehow work in the Middle East. And I think it's important to remember that with the era of information and the era of being able to communicate, people simply don't like to be oppressed. Some people maybe think that they enjoy being oppressed, but people don't like it. They naturally desire freedom. And in that process of being, whether it's a chemical weapon attack, whether it's a conventional weapon attack, losing your father or your mother or your child makes you much more likely to join an opposition force, which up till recently appears to have been ISIS in many cases. I want to thank you and the administration for putting what I think was an amazing red line down in the statement about a pending potential chemical weapons attack. As you said earlier, I think that saved countless lives. There are a lot of children that now hopefully can realize their dream of being a police officer or a teacher because of that really strong line. So it's great having you there. It's great having an administration that understands this. Let me just ask a little about Syria and the discussion of that next generational war on terror. I think it's the 7- and 8-year-olds today that are in the refugee camps that are either not getting education or are getting education that are going to be either the folks that in, frankly, 5 years, because that's how young they recruit them, that we find ourselves having to fight on the battlefield, or else they're going to be the generation that actually rejects this ideology from within. Can you talk about kind of the difficulties in the refugee camps and the difficulties, I guess, in Syria generally, and how that plays into the long-term fight on terror that we have on our hands?
Yes, and so first of all, with Syria, I would remind you that the post-ISIS decisions that are made on Syria are going to be extremely important to make sure that it's not a new breeding ground for other threats to come in. And having talked with the Syrian refugees, both in the camps and outside of the camps, they are completely ready and waiting to go there and build it back up from scratch. They want to go home. They have family members there. That's something that I think is going to continue to happen. When it comes to the education, so what we know is the refugees that have come out, those children are they're getting educated, they're getting assistance, they're being well taken care of. All of those things are fine. There are about 300,000 students in Turkey that are not getting educated, but the 3 million people are, and they're trying to accommodate that, and that's why I'm trying to get the UN to focus on supporting host countries so we can get those kids educated as well. In Syria, I don't think they are getting educated in Syria. Now, I'm sure every area is different, but it's just such a mess because we're just still trying to get aid in there. We're still trying to get food in there and make sure that they're taken care of. But it's not just in Syria, in any area around the world. If you have children who have to do without, whether it's education, whether it's health care, any of those things, they are prime targets for terrorists to get them. And we have to always remember that as we go forward, because that is, yes, we can defeat ISIS today, but those threats will go on forever. And that's why I put so much emphasis on human rights as it relates to conflict, because those things are what drive terrorists to come in and take advantage of the situation.
And I thank you for being part of that whole of government approach. I mean, I think sometimes we get mired down in this idea that when the Islamic State is defeated, we can all come home and have fun rainbows and happy time. But the reality is you can't defeat an ideology with bombs and bullets. You can only defeat existing terrorists. And so it's important to think long term because, frankly, this is going to be a long-term war. And I think, you know, specifically a great country I got the privilege of visiting was Liberia. And there's a strong UN mission there. I think it's important to note that when we talk about the United Nations, though needing reforms, can be a force multiplier, doing things that our troops don't have to do. But you see in that a whole generation that was torn apart by civil war, and people that mean and want to do well, but you see 30-year-olds that don't know how to read and write with no hope. And when that happens in the Middle East, that is a fertile ground for recruitment. So, again, I just want to say thank you so much for your service. Thanks for being here, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much.
Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for your testimony today.
Thank you.
And I think your time during your service during this president's tenure, I think, has been one of the more moderating voices on what I consider to be some of their more outlandish moves. But I think it's also put folks like yourself and Secretary Tillerson in a box sometimes. And so I want to ask you a question that I've been asked many times by the foreign ministers, ambassadors, members of parliaments that I've met with since President Trump took office, which is who reliably speaks for the president in the foreign policy space?
So we work very much as a team, and the team works strongly. We have, in our NSC meetings, I have a great relationship, and we talk through things with Tillerson, Mattis, McMaster. We have Kelly, and I mean, everybody there. That group is the main group in General Dunford. Those are the main people. Pompeo is another important one. We go through all aspects of everything when it comes to dealing with that. So it really is a
So there is a process in place that...
And a very organized process in place. General McMaster has done a fantastic job, and all of our voices are heard, and all of us get to help push that decision.
Do you feel as though the president takes your advice?
I think that the president, you know, then General McMaster has to do that. I think the president does. He's turned out to be a very good listener in terms of the fact that he wants to learn and he appreciates different viewpoints, and then he makes his decision.
Well, I guess probably the most glaring example or problematic example that I've seen was when Prime Minister Netanyahu came for a joint press conference, and the idea of a one-state solution rather than a two-state solution was broached. I believe while Secretary Tillerson was on a plane somewhere, was not present, and then the next day you had to come back and basically say, no, our approach is still a two-state solution. And then the president later said, well, it's really whatever the parties want to do.
Right.
So you can imagine around the world that people start wondering, who's speaking for the president?
Well, and in fairness to everybody involved with that, the president has very much felt like we don't need to push what the solution is between Israel and the Palestinians, that we need to have them come to the table and make those decisions. So his point was, if they come up with a one-state, if they come up with a two-state, whatever they come up with, we're going to support. And the way it got out, I agree with you, the communication was weird, but that was his intention. So we knew very much that he wasn't giving up on a two-state solution. He just was saying, whatever they come up with, we will support. And if that's a one-state solution, we'll support that too.
Well, and then I guess a more recent example is the example of Qatar, where the president was essentially praising the blockade, and at the same time, because we have a base there and other interests, we seem to be, other parts of our foreign policy apparatus seem to be coming to the defense of Qatar. Again, there seem to be at least two heads there. What happened on that issue?
It's a complicated issue, and like I said, I've given my opinion. I think there's an opportunity to hit both sides and try and get more of what we want. Qatar has been funding. We know that they have done a lot with Hamas as we're dealing with Gaza and some other areas, and so I think the president really does want to push out ISIS, push out terrorism. And his whole point of going and making that first visit was to say, we've got to get rid of all of these threats that we have. So when this came up with Qatar, his focus was very much on the funding they were doing for terrorists. And I think that, yes, we have a air base there. Yes, there's some ties, but he sees the priority as getting rid of ISIS and getting rid of terrorism as right there at the top.
And then finally, because I just have about 50 seconds left, I'm on the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, and Venezuela, of course, is a big issue. I know you've probably fielded a question from Albiocides perhaps on it, but what is your outlook for Venezuela and for the region?
It's worse than what we're seeing on TV. It's in a very bad place. And what I had said before was, we did an emergency session in the Security Council. They weren't happy with that. They felt like it needed to go to the Human Rights Council, but we still had it. We went to the Human Rights Council. The reason they have not brought it up, which they need to, is because Venezuela sits on the Human Rights Council, and so we blasted them on that. We were banking on OAS doing something. That didn't happen. This needs to be on our radar. Maduro is leaning more and more towards using military force and weapons, and I think that this is something that is only going to get worse before it gets better, and we need to make sure that we're watching this carefully and do something about it.
Thanks for your service.
Thank you.
Lee Zeldin of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for your service to our country and for being here today.
Thank you.
UN Security Council Resolution 2334 was an anti-Israel, anti-Jewish resolution seeking to ethnically cleanse Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem. Is it an accurate summary of your observations since taking over as ambassador that some of the nations that voted for this resolution were resentful, some were apologetic, and it appears to have been U.S.-led and U.S.-pushed?
I talked to all of the Security Council members and told them how offended and what a kick in the gut it was for Americans. What I got was some felt very arm-twisted by the U.S. Others thought it was the right thing to do. And then, the hard part about me talking with 2334 is they keep telling me, well, it's the U.S. that wanted it, it's the U.S. that wanted it. So it's hard for me at this point. I'm just saying there's a new administration. This is not where we want to go. And so now they don't talk to me about it because they know it's such a sore subject with us.
And your testimony is confirmation that the U.S. was engaging in dangerous, ugly backstabbing of our nation's ally in Israel, and we abstained. And when Ben Rhodes and others were on a conference call, and this is in the White House records, I'm quoting verbatim, when asked why we abstained, Ben Rhodes, the taxpayer-funded White House fiction writer, says, quote, "We abstained, as Samantha explained, for a number of reasons. First, the United Nations, we continue to believe, is a flawed venue for this issue in that it has frequently been used to single out Israel. Not only was that effort U.S.-led and U.S.-pushed, but then publicly we were abstaining, and we were abstaining for the reason that I just quoted from Ben Rhodes. And I really appreciate your testimony to help clear the record and the history on that.
Well, and if I could just add, I respect Samantha Power and have and appreciate her service very much, but that was one of our lowest points in our country with what happened, because the international community, when they saw that we went against an ally, it set off a terrible tone in terms of where we're going to go. And just to let you know how bad it was, when she abstained, the entire Security Council and the audience got up and applauded. And Israel was sitting there with their wife watching that. Think about what we just did to a friend, what happened. You don't ever applaud in the Security Council. It never happens. It happened that day.
And I think it's clear from anyone in Israel who would be listening to your testimony here today that you have the back of America's allies. You understand that we should be strengthening our relationship with our friends, treating our adversaries as our adversaries, and I'm very happy that you're there. I do want to ask about the Taylor Force Act which has now growing bipartisan support in Congress, which would withhold aid to the Palestinian Authority until it stops inciting violence and financially rewarding terrorists, a policy otherwise known as pay to slay. Have you taken any position or are you able to share with regards to what your opinion is on the Taylor Force Act?
So I've met with the family, and yes, I'm very vocal about the fact that the U.S. gives bilateral money to the Palestinian Authority, and we need to have a strong conversation with them on how these martyr payments have to stop. And I think that it's one of those things that by us giving money, we're supporting it, and we have to make that correlation with them and let them know that that's not something that we're going to accept or do going forward.
And I think it's great that you did meet with the family, Taylor Force. This isn't an Israeli. It's an American who graduated from the United States Military Academy, and I appreciate your leadership. In my remaining time, I'm going to yield to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Ambassador, we're so proud, as your resident member of Congress, to be here with you, also a fellow resident of Lexington County. As a South Carolinian, we're so proud of your efforts to reverse, as Congressman Zeldin has so correctly pointed out, the anti-Israel policies. It's just what a breath of fresh air. I also want to thank you, too, as I met with you in New York last week. Thank you so much. Your first speech was to condemn Russian aggression in Ukraine, 10,000 people dead. Russian aggression in the Republic of Georgia. We're very proud of your service, and I'm at the National Defense Authorization Act debate right now, so I need to run back. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, and thank you for being my congressman.
Thank you.
Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you.
I actually wanted to raise an issue that has not been brought up yet, I think, for the 2.5 hours of this hearing. Yesterday, we saw all around the world one of the worst cyber attacks ever to strike. Hacks targeted government ministries, banks, utilities, and other important infrastructure and companies, especially in Ukraine. Ukraine, again, suffered the extent of that attack worse than any other country, including, by the way, the virus downed systems at the site of the former Chernobyl, forcing scientists to monitor radiation levels manually. So I have introduced, along with my colleague on the other side of the aisle, Congressman Fitzpatrick, also from Pennsylvania, we've introduced H.R. 1997, the Ukraine Cybersecurity Cooperation Act, in order for the United States to help our ally in an area in which they're clearly vulnerable, and that vulnerability has been exploited. Do you think such an act would be helpful, and do you believe that your role at the UN would be aided if the United States Congress would provide leadership in helping an ally like Ukraine when it comes to cybersecurity?
So cyber attacks are the new ammunition that we're going to continue to see around the world, and it continues to be worse and worse as every country continues to see how they can make it better. I can tell you that the UN now is trying to become the cyber activity police, and we don't want that because we don't want China and Russia deciding how the U.S. would handle cyber attacks or dictate how we handle those things going forward. So we are fighting that. But yes, I think it would be helpful if the U.S. goes and does these things. It would keep the UN from doing it and would allow for us to continue to help. And Ukraine, I can't say enough about what a great ally they've been on the Security Council. They have just been with us on everything.
So this is actually a good segue to the broader issue of our support for Ukraine. Your comments that you gave just now and others inspire a lot more confidence than the comments of our President and the Secretary of State when it comes to standing up and supporting our ally, Ukraine, turning back Russian aggression and occupation, illegal occupation of Crimea, and what they're continuing to do to this day in eastern Ukraine, which often gets ignored in the media. I wanted to ask you about that, though, because obviously with the President, the Secretary of State, our ambassador to the UN, we've had, frankly, 3 different messages, at least 2 different messages. Do we, the United States, still stand and support and stand by the agreement that was reached in Minsk, the Minsk agreement?
Yes, we do.
Okay, that you realize is contrary to what the Secretary of State has recently said, that there would be we would allow a certain amount of backsliding or a renegotiation of it agreeable to both parties. How do you reconcile that?
We continue to push the Minsk agreement. We just renewed sanctions last week on Russia's role in Crimea. We're not lifting those. We're going to continue to stay strong on that. And so at the Security Council, that's what I'm pushing. That's what I'm doing.
And you would agree that we shouldn't offer any sanction relief before Russia would finally live up to its obligation in Minsk?
Absolutely.
That's great. Have you had this conversation with the Secretary of State and even with the President himself?
So the President and I have had a conversation with Ukraine and Russia. He very much wants to see how we can reconcile, if there's any way to, how much this is. When I brought the Security Council, not only did they meet with members of Congress, but they met with General McMaster, they met with the President and others, and Ukraine and Russia both sit on the Security Council. And so they also had conversations with him. I'll remind you that my position is a cabinet position. So when I say something or I do something, yes, those are my views and those are my thoughts, and that's what I share with General McMaster and with the President. And so they're very aware of my thoughts on this and have not disagreed with me on that.
Yeah. I do want to point out, one of my colleagues referenced this earlier, I can't tell you the number of times that, because of being on this committee now several years, have relationships with diplomats from other countries, including parliamentarians in other countries. The number of people who have asked me, so who really speaks for this administration? Because the Secretary of State will say one thing, President contradicts it within the hour. You give comments at the UN that are frankly more reflective of a traditional U.S. Truman through Obama foreign policy. So that continues to be a challenge and ends up making the U.S. look, frankly, incoherent in its foreign policy and makes your job more difficult.
Well, we work very well together, and we work closely together. And while we don't just say the exact word-for-word talking points, we are all moving in the same direction.
The ambassador has to depart at 1 p.m., so I'm going to ask members to be succinct. We go now to the co-sponsor of the legislation with Mr. Boyle, and that's Brian Fitzpatrick.
Madam Ambassador, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you for being a good leader. More importantly, thank you for being a good person. I think it's evident to anybody who is in your presence that you have a good heart, and that's the most important quality you can have, so don't change, please, okay? Couple things. I want to thank you for your support for Israel. We've covered that a lot. Focusing in on Ukraine, which my colleague, Mr. Boyle, had alluded to. Brennan's legislation is outstanding. It's critically important. If you could do me a favor, review that, and any support that you and the administration could give to that would be very, very helpful. From a philosophical standpoint, because right now we're in the budgetary process, we're being asked to make some really tough decisions between military spending, diplomatic spending. From a philosophical standpoint, some people believe that U.S. intervention is only appropriate when our national security interests are imminently at threat. Other people take the view that when there's atrocities occurring around the world, that the U.S. cannot ethically, morally turn a blind eye to that. So your philosophy on when intervention is appropriate from all components, if you could comment on that.
Well, I think that the U.S. should always have a strong voice. You always have to pick a side. When it comes on any issue, I just think abstentions are nothing that I believe in. I think you have to pick a side one way or the other, and you have to tell what we're for, and you have to tell what the U.S. is against. And that doesn't mean that you're cutting countries off. It means that on every issue, we're going to have a different thought, and we have to just communicate that and make that known. We are the moral compass around the world. We have been. Doesn't mean we're perfect, but that's what we try and do. And so U.S. values, for us to continue to own those and express those, I think is an important part of who we are. I also think that we are a leader, and we're a leader that many other countries look to see what we're going to do, and they make their decisions on that. And so we need to always look at what our role is going to be, and we need to decide place by place as opposed to just a blanket policy, because all of these conflicts that we're seeing now are completely different. And so I think taking a custom approach to all of the conflicts and how we think we can be the strongest and most supportive to bring a political solution is very important.
I yield back.
Gentleman yield. My friend yield.
we'd like to get to the junior members if we could. We're going to go to Dina Titus of Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
You said early on several times that we could count on you to be a thorn in the side of Russia or a thorn in the side of somewhere. But that's kind of like saying you're going to be a burr under the saddle or a pea under the princess. That sounds like we're more of an irritant than we are a leader. And that's what worries some of us on this committee about what's happening to the image of the country. Also, I'd like to go back to something that Mr. Meeks mentioned earlier, and that's that poll that showed our image declining internationally. It says since the inauguration of President Trump, according to citizens of 27 countries from around the world, we have just gone downhill. You think that the president's doing a pretty good job, but the rest of the world doesn't seem to think so. 64% had confidence in the U.S. president at the end of the Obama administration. That number has fallen to 22%. At the end of the Obama administration, 64% had a favorable view of the United States. Now it's just 49%. I represent Las Vegas, and you know that's an international city. We welcome visitors from 8 million foreign visitors from all around the globe every year. But we've seen a real decrease in the interest in coming to the United States by foreign visitors. According to the U.S. Global Travel Association, there's going to be a $1.3 billion loss in 2017. That's 4,200 jobs in communities like Las Vegas and Charleston. So all the signs show that if we don't work to correct this, it's going to have a major impact on a big part of our economy. In fact, a recent survey showed that 45% of European business travelers said that they would plan future meetings somewhere else because it's too difficult to come and travel to the United States. You said when you were governor that we want to continue to sell to the rest of the country and the world how great of a place South Carolina is to visit. And you also said when you were trumpeting the state's economic tourism basis that what it tells everybody across the world is if you haven't been here, get here quickly, and if you have, get back. Well, that's kind of what we like to say in Las Vegas, too. But I wonder if you really believe that the Trump administration has been a good salesperson for international tourism. If you're concerned about this image decline and these statistics, and as our representative to the United Nations, what you're doing to try to just repair that image, put the welcome mat out instead of saying, no, we don't want you to come.
So first, in reference to being a thorn in the side, being a thorn in the side means that I call out something when I think it's wrong. And I think that that's part of what the U.S. does, and I think that it's also praising when things are right, it's criticizing when things are wrong, and acting accordingly. And so I stand by my comments on that. I'll tell you, in reference to your poll, I have not seen it, but whereas that's 27 countries, I deal with 192, and the overwhelming feeling is that we are unpredictable. They don't know exactly what we're going to do, but it has kept them more on alert in terms of wanting to be there with us, not wanting to get on the wrong side of us. So I haven't felt that. My goal is to have a relationship with everyone and to make sure that I show that the U.S. wants to get political solutions to all things and work with countries to do that. And so I always try and do that as we go forward. In terms of the economy, and you brought up South Carolina, which I'm very proud of, we have multiple international businesses continuing to come in. Our economy's through the roof, and we have record years in tourism, and we're not seeing a decline in any way on international tourism, trade, any of those things. And so I do think that the president has set a tone. Every president sets a tone. And we always have sides who agree with the tone or don't agree with the tone. But my job is to make sure that I'm on the side of the U.S. And
you don't think unpredictability is dangerous? It leads to instability and can be a problem in international diplomacy?
In my job, I've found it's made my negotiations better, and it's made it easier because they don't assume, they don't take us for granted anymore. They no longer look at us as one that they can just push over and know exactly what we're going to do. So for me, it's been helpful.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Tom Garrett of Virginia.
First, I want to thank the chair for looking out for the junior members. We represent roughly the same number of people as the senior members, and I'm grateful. I'm going to ask a series of questions that are really simple and seeking a relatively short answer. Do you think that conspiracy theories about things like Russian meddling in the outcome of our election that are propagated by some members of this body as well as the media, the basis of which a CNN exec recently called BS but ran the stories anyway, might contribute to diminished opinions in the United States around the world?
No one at the United Nations is talking about this issue at all.
But the questioning, ma'am, with all due respect,
Yes, it
was
does not
about
help the
okay.
situation.
And do you think that rhetoric that says that because we have disagreements over things like health care policy, the president and the Republicans want to kill children and old people might contribute to diminished feelings about the United States across the world?
That is far from the truth.
But do you think that rhetoric might contribute to a diminished opinion of the nation?
Of course.
Okay. And are you familiar with the quote by Vandenberg that said, "Politics stop at the water's edge"?
Yes.
Has that been your experience since you've served in your current capacity?
You know, I think my job is to sit there and ignore what's happening in D.C. because I've found the rhetoric has just been over the top.
Isn't it? And so I'm not going to ask the follow-up question because I respect where you're coming from and appreciate the job you do. And the fact that you've done it in a manner such that you personally, at least, have received bipartisan praise for in this meeting, but I think we reap what we sow as it relates to how people view us, and that the reckless hurling of invective not undergirded by facts obviously would perpetuate those who don't like us not liking us. Now, moving on to something more pressing. The UN Security Council Resolution 2231 essentially endorsed the JCPOA, which I've repeatedly and for the press gone on record as calling the JCPOS. I will tell you that 2231 repealed what was UN Security Council Resolution 1929. You're probably familiar with this. I'm not confident who the prior administration had negotiating the JCPOA, but are you aware that UN Security Council Resolution 2231 stated, quote, "Iran shall not undertake any activity related to ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons," and that it was replaced by a UN resolution commending the JCPOA that read, "Iran is called upon not to undertake any activity related to ballistic missiles," and then they gave a little bit more latitude, designed to carry nuclear payload. Are you aware of this?
It is one of the most dangerous things that happened when we passed the JCPOA because basically what you did was you just deferred what's going to happen and you gave them a bunch of money to do it. And now you see that they don't follow the rules by 2231 with the testing, with the...
Well, I would argue that they didn't violate the rules of 2231 because 2231 endorses the JCPOA, and the JCPOA says is called upon not to instead of shall not. And who wrote that? And that's a rhetorical question for our nation with the security of ourselves and our allies in mind, and how incompetent or nefarious are they? You don't need, it's rhetorical. Again, with all due respect. So my question becomes, is there a way, and I have no clue to the answer, to repeal 2231 and actually go back to the United Nations resolution, which was more effective in deterring Iranian aggression than what the United States led a multi-nation coalition in hammering out? Is there any way to go back from 1929 to 2231, which says shall not as opposed to is called upon not to?
Russia would veto it.
Okay, and that leads beautifully, almost like we coordinated this, into my next question. So there's been Russian aggression in South Ossetia. I'm going to probably butcher some of these names. Abkhazia, the Georgian regions. There's been Russian aggression in East Ukraine and Crimea. There's been a Russian and China veto of UN actions regarding the tragedy and crisis in Syria. How, and we spoke yesterday with the Secretary General, and he said, well, there's so many things we can't do because Security Council members would veto them. How do we make this organization with such lofty ideals an effective player on the world stage? And part two, it's tangentially related, how do we repair the message that was sent when Ms. Power abstained that we will not be loyal to our allies by virtue of how we conduct ourselves today at the UN? Thank you.
So my number one goal is to make the Security Council action, make it mean something. I think that the fact that we're not seeing a lot of resolutions against Israel shows that that part is working. I think that Russia does stop a lot of things, and lately Russia stops anything the U.S. is for. That is a long line of reasoning. China can do the same thing. I do think we've made huge strides in terms of peacekeeping reforms and what we're going to do on management reforms, and the fact that we just saved $500 million on the peacekeeping budget was a huge win, and so we're going to continue to do that. But the one thing I will tell you is we are going to continue to talk about 2334 as something that the U.S. does not support, does not endorse, and if given the opportunity, that will never happen again.
Thank you.
Norma Torres of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Ambassador Haley. I know the time has been long, and I apologize that we have not given you a short break.
No worries.
Regarding Syria, I agree with you. We can never take Syria back to what it was. So through this horrific conflict, last December, the General Assembly created the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism to collect and analyze evidence about the atrocities in Syria. I want to know what specific steps has the United States taken to advance this mechanism?
So interestingly enough, the Security Council supported the Joint Investigative Mechanism unanimously. They decided what it would do, how it would happen, and what things take place. Since that has happened, and since we've had the Syrian atrocities with chemical weapons and everything else, Russia now says it's not a fair mechanism, even though they were the ones that helped put it together. We continue to support the JIM. We will continue to push the JIM, but Russia continues to undermine it and say that it's not something that's effective.
Speaking about Russia, on April 27th, you stated that Russia continues to cover for the Syria regime. Russia continues to allow them to keep humanitarian aid from the people that need it. Russia continues to cover for a leader who uses chemical weapons against its own people. Russia continues to veto, and Assad continues to do these things because they know Russia will continue to cover for them. Do you still stand by that statement?
You know, I think General Mattis has implied that things are starting to move, and I hope that's the case, but that has definitely been the case in the past, and I would love to see all of that change.
So do you still stand by that statement?
Yes.
Okay, great. Although Russia and China have not sent over a jet fighter plane, although submarines are nearing our coast, there are other things that they have done, both, that have impacted our economy greatly. One of them is happening now. With the Port of Los Angeles is the last victim of this global cyber attack. Now, I understand that we're still investigating. We don't know exactly where that is. So I find it hard to believe, and I would like to get clarification from you on your statement when you said, regarding Mr. Boyle's question, that you do not want China or Russia to dictate how we approach these attacks. And I get, somewhat where you're trying to get at that. But I'm also concerned that there isn't a conversation, within 192 countries that you deal with about Russia's influence in our election, about their influence in the European elections, and most recently in Germany's election. How can that be? How can we not see cyber attacks or influence in our elections as a threat to our democracy, as a threat to our economic standing?
So it is a threat. And I think what you are seeing, and I've talked with my counterparts, is we're seeing them intervene in multiple elections. I've talked with the ambassadors about it. Everyone sees it as a problem, and I do think it's something that's going to come up. I do think it's something that's going to surface because it's affecting so many other countries in the process. What we don't want is for the UN to regulate cyber situations, because they would put China and they would put Russia on it because they're two P5 members. And so we don't want to do that, because as they've done in so many other cases, they take care of themselves and they hurt everyone else.
I have 1 minute left, and now I'm going to move on to an easier question. I understand that the residence of the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations has moved from the Waldorf Astoria to a different high-rise building close to the United Nations. In 2015, a Chinese company purchased the Waldorf Astoria for $1.95 billion, and the U.S. presence there was under review since we have strong concerns about the security implications of Chinese ownership. China's linked hackers have been accused of perpetrating the massive breach of personnel records that compromise the data of millions of our own federal employees. So I'm very happy that the residence in New York has moved so that we can ensure the security of our personnel and your security. But I would also like to get further clarity from you regarding the future of the residence, since the Trump Tower is only a mile away. I want to ensure that you're not thinking about moving and spending taxpayers' dollars at the Trump Tower.
No, I'm not. I did not pick this location. We did move because China bought it, and for the reasons that you stated. I did not pick this location, but I will stay I will stay in this location until it's time for me to leave. But no, I am not moving to the Trump Tower.
Thank you, and I appreciate your visit. Yield back.
Mark Meadows of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Haley, thank you so much for enduring almost 3 hours of questioning in such an eloquent way. I think representing North Carolina, I get to share the same television market with you when you were governor. And I must confess, I am so unbelievably impressed with your grasp of foreign policy coming from a governor to your particular position now. Being someone who loves foreign policy, there are nuances that we could trip you up each and every time with a question, and yet you've been able to masterfully answer those from either side of the aisle, so thank you. Let me drill down a little bit further, because as you know, whether it was in South Carolina or in North Carolina, there is a huge pushback for spending American taxpayer dollars on something and then having our member states vote against the United States over and over and over again. And so it's been one of those areas where I had a wonderful meeting with the UN Secretary General yesterday, who, by the way, holds you in very high regard. I was very impressed with him, I mean, in his desire to reform the UN, because many times member states have, I guess, a pushback when it comes to reforming. Because that may mean that monies don't flow necessarily as easily to their host country. Would you be willing to work with members of Congress on the voting records of member states to help us identify when they vote with us and when they do not vote with us, so that we can have a very accurate account and perhaps tie it a little bit closer to foreign aid?
So yes, I absolutely would be willing to work with you, but I would say we need to use leverage. So I gave the example earlier, you know, for example, we give a lot of money to the Palestinian Authority. We should tell them that we can't continue to give money if they continue to have martyr payments.
Right.
And if they continue, so if we can tie
And
it.
that doesn't mean just changing it from the PLA to the PLO, because they stopped it in one and they moved it to the other.
So I don't think we should do it by percentages of how much they vote with us. I think we should do it by leverage on policy issues that we can change.
All right, and so we have worked up a new report with the Congressional Research Service in terms of dollars given and how they vote with us. And I was amazed to see billions of dollars going to many of these different countries, and yet when it comes to Israel, they vote with us 4% of the time. Can you take a message to many of your ambassador friends in New York and tell them that that dog will not hunt?
I would love that list.
And so
Yes.
the time has come. There's a new sheriff in town, and we're going to look at it very, very closely. Will you take that message back
I will
to
take that message. I have told them that we will no longer be a pushover, and they can't take our U.S. funding for granted any longer. And I would love that list.
All right, and we will get that to you. And the last thing I would say is, would you consider Israel's human rights record to be better than that of Iran?
Yes.
So why is it perplexing? I noticed that you had an op-ed where you showed that there was 70 resolutions against Israel and only 7 against Iran. Can you fathom any logical reason why the UN would do that?
Because they always have.
All right. Can you take another message to them that dog won't hunt either?
That's right.
All right. And if you will,
Message already sent and will continue.
All right. Well, thank you, Ambassador Haley. And with the last remaining minute, I'm going to yield to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, so he can follow up on one question.
I thank my
And again, I'm going to suggest to the members, our goal was to reach all of the junior members. But gentleman from New Jersey is right.
Well, some things were said that need to be corrected, and I would like to just get this on the record. I would like to thank the administration for faithfully and very effectively implementing longstanding U.S. law initiated under Ronald Reagan, which requires the shutoff of U.S. funds to any organization, and not just the UNFPA, but any organization that supports or co-manages a coercive population control program. Since 1979, China has required women to get permission to have a child. You don't have a child unless you get permission. Forced abortion is commonplace, it's pervasive, as is forced sterilization. And as you pointed out, Madam Ambassador, every dollar that doesn't go to the UNFPA will go to some other NGO or entity that will do the same type of work: family planning, maternal and child health. And I think this is a very important, and I could go on, but I'm out of time.
Thank you.
The committee made a commitment to Ambassador Haley to end at 1 p.m. Ambassador, I'd ask that you respond to additional questions in writing. We go now to Mr. Bradley Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here. I want to personally thank you. Your staff has taken the time to meet with us on issues such as sexual violence and exploitation, and I look forward to continuing to work together. I'm going to apologize if I get a tap on my shoulder. We have a vote in another committee on refugees, and I will stop and let you out. But we've talked about refugees. We've talked about human rights, and as Mr. Smith touched on, what's happening in China. I want to bring you back to UNRWA, if I can. And in your opening remarks, you said that there's an issue of culture versus incitement, as they were talking to you about it. And I would argue that culture is something that comes through education. And the education that's happening in the territories is incitement. And if we're going to have a prospect for peace, if we're going to have a prospect for two states living side by side in security and peace, a Jewish state of Israel and a Palestinian state, the culture is going to have to accept that. And that's going to come from the education. In other questions, you have addressed the issue of education and the importance to educate young people in the territories, which I could not agree with more. My question is, as you look at UNRWA, it's been in place for 70 years. It has issues of harboring terrorists, working with terrorists. You can go on and on. Is there the opportunity to take the beneficial services, as you said, that there are good that comes from UNRWA, and find perhaps other agencies, whether it's the High Commission for Refugees or other, the PA itself, and get to a point where after 70 years, this special, unique situation with UNRWA can be streamlined into the operations of the UN and the Palestinian Authority to move us toward peace?
First of all, I agree with everything that you said, and yes,
And excuse me, I'll leave you to answer, but I have to go vote.
we have talked to the Secretary General, and yes, we have made that push and would support that push.
Well, I want to thank Ambassador Haley for your testimony here today. It is 1 o'clock, and you have a lot of work to do with a reform agenda at the UN, and many have tried before you, and they haven't found a lot of success, so we wish you well.
Thank you.
We'll be backing you, and we can see from your attitude you intend to succeed in this. But while it's frustrating, it's needed work because several UN agencies do important work. And I mentioned the value of peacekeeping and the need to make it better. And our security should never be delegated to the United Nations. I know you won't do that. But our security can also be improved when the U.S. rallies the world, including at the UN. So if I were to think of an example that comes to mind immediately, it would be the North Korean resolution passed through the Security Council as an example. And, of course, we need better enforcement. We thank you for your commitment to that enforcement. Ambassador Haley, we look forward to following up on several of the issues that were raised today. Myself and the ranking member will see you in New York, and we all look forward to seeing you again in the committee. We stand adjourned.
Thank you very much.